the morning Earl Hadley drained the pond. The sky was the color of old dishwater. Low clouds pressed down over the valley like they had nowhere better to be, and the air smelled of wet clay and something older underneath. The kind of smell that comes out of ground that hasn't seen daylight in a long time. Earl didn't notice the smell at first. He was too tired to notice much of anything. He'd been up since 4:30. Same as always, the alarm clock on the nightstand doing its mechanical screaming while the dark outside the bedroom window stayed absolutely black. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, sat there for a moment with his head hanging, then pushed himself upright because the cows didn't care about his sleep and neither did the rest of it. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The farm had been in the Hadley name for 61 years. Earl's father, Lester, had bought the land in 1963 with money saved from 2 decades of factory work in Dayton, Ohio, and the quiet, furious determination of a man who believed owning ground was the only real kind of freedom. Lester had broken the first fields himself, working until his hands split in the cold, planting corn and soybeans in rotation, running a small cattle operation that never made them rich, but kept them fed and kept the bank at a manageable distance. Earl had watched all of it growing up, watched his father fix broken equipment in the dark flashlight, held in his teeth, watched him negotiate with seed suppliers and argue with weather and lose sometimes and keep going anyway. When Lester died in 2001, he left Earl the farm, 63 acres in Carroll County, Ohio, and a note on the kitchen table that said, "Only don't sell it." Earl hadn't, but the years since had not been gentle. The cattle numbers had dropped from 42 head to 19 over the past decade. Each loss tied to some particular piece of bad luck. A brutal winter, a market dip, a vet bill that came at the wrong moment. The corn operation had contracted to just under 40 acres, and even that smaller footprint struggled in years when the rains came too hard or not enough. Earl was 53 years old, and he looked 65. The lines in his face were the kind that came from squinting at weather and worrying about money, and his back made a sound in the morning that no back should make in a man, not yet 60. He lived alone. Had lived alone for going on 9 years. Since Linda took the girls and moved to her sister's place in Steubenville and the divorce papers came through on a Thursday in February when the ground was frozen and there was nothing to do with his hands except go out to the barn and work on something mechanical that didn't require him to feel anything, his daughters called. Macy, the older one, called on Sundays. Jolene, the younger, sent texts that were sometimes just photographs of her kids in a backyard somewhere in Columbus, as if to say, "Look, Dad, things are still growing." Earl appreciated it more than he ever said. The pond was the thing that finally pushed him to act. It sat in the northwest corner of the property, about 3 acres of standing water that had been there as long as the Hadley family had. His father used it as a water source for the cattle, stringing fence around 3 sides to keep the herd from fouling the banks and running a gravity-fed pipe to a trough near the main barn. For years, it had worked fine. But in the last 2 seasons, something had shifted. The banks had softened, turned muddy, and unstable where the water was undermining the soil from below. The cattle were breaking through the fence and getting stuck in the mud at the water's edge, and Earl had already pulled 2 cows out with the tractor this spring alone. Both of them panicked and half sunk, legs churning uselessly in the clay. The last one had taken 3 hours. Earl had stood in that mud up to his knees, rope around the animal's neck, tractor at full extension, the cow screaming in the wet and the dark, while his back screamed right along with it. When it was over and the animal was out and standing, shaking and wild-eyed in the field, Earl sat down in the dirt next to the pond and looked at the water and said out loud to no one, "Something's got to change." He'd called an agricultural extension agent named Dennis Pike out of Carrollton to look at the banks. Dennis came on a Tuesday, walked the perimeter with hands in his pockets, kicked at the soil in a few places, and told Earl what he already knew. The banks were compromised. The water was too high relative to the soil composition. The fix was either to excavate the edges and regrade the banks with engineered fill, which would run $12,000 to $15,000. Earl did not have, or to drain the pond, let the bottom dry out, and regrade the whole basin from scratch before refilling it. Draining was cheaper, not free, but considerably cheaper. He rented the pump from an equipment dealer in Minerva, a diesel submersible. Serious equipment, not the kind of thing you used on a garden pond. The dealer's son helped him get it into the back of the pickup. It weighed 240 pounds and sat in the truck bed like a declaration of intent. Earl set it up on a Tuesday, fed the discharge hose out across the lower field toward the drainage ditch at the property's edge, primed the pump, and pulled the cord. The diesel caught on the second pull. The hose went rigid. Water started moving. He stood there and watched it for a while, this steady flow of brown water moving across his field in a hose. The pond going nowhere visibly, at first the surface looking the same. Then after 20 minutes he could see it. A dark line at the water line on the bank, maybe half an inch lower than it had been. The pump was working. He left it running and went to do the rest of the day's work. That night, sitting at the kitchen table with a bowl of soup and the television on in the other room, making noise at no one, Earl did the math on the pond project. The pump rental was $90 a day. He figured it would take 4 to 5 days to get the water level down far enough to work the banks. Then 2 days of excavation with a rented mini excavator, another $150 a day, then the fill material, the grading work. He had maybe $4,000 in the operating account, and that money was supposed to cover the summer's inputs. He did what he always did when the numbers didn't work out, right. He closed the notebook, put it in the drawer, and went to bed. By Thursday morning, the pond was down about 3 feet. Earl could see the bottom along the north bank, a broad shelf of dark clay that had been underwater. So long it had no texture anymore, just a flat, smooth expanse of grey-brown that sucked at his boots when he walked out onto it to check the pump. Intake. The air over the exposed mud smelled different from regular pond mud, older, more compressed, like something that had been sealed away had started breathing again. He moved the pump intake further toward the center as the water retreated. By Friday evening, the pond was half empty. Earl walked the exposed banks after supper, the light going orange and sideways across the clay, and looked at the job ahead. The north and west banks were the worst, soft, and undercut where the water had been working at them from below for years. The south bank was harder, older, more stable. He could see why the water had been undermining the north side specifically. There was a natural slope to the land that pushed water pressure toward that corner. He made notes in the small spiral notebook he carried in his shirt pocket. Saturday morning. He was up before 4. He couldn't sleep past that anymore. Hadn't been able to for years. The alarm was almost unnecessary. His body just decided it was time and started whether he was ready or not. He made coffee in the dark kitchen. The only light, the small bulb above the stove. He could hear the pump running out in the field, a low diesel grumble that had become the background sound of the farm for the past 4 days. Steady and relentless, he drank the coffee, standing at the window, looking out at nothing. Around 6:15, with the sky beginning to come up grey and cool in the east, he walked out to check the water level. The pond was 3/4 drained, maybe more. What remained was a dark pool in the center of the basin, smaller and stranger looking than the pond had ever seemed when it was full, like looking at something's eye after most of the face was gone. The exposed basin floor stretched wide around it, cracked in places now where the sun had started working on the upper surface, dark and glistening further down where the clay was still wet. No kid. Earl stood at the bank and looked at it. Something was different this morning. He noticed it before he could have said what it was. Some shift in the scene that his eyes registered before his brain caught up. He scanned the basin floor slowly, the way you scan a field for problems methodically, section by section there, on the south end of the exposed floor, maybe 40 yards from where he stood, something breaking the flat plane of the mud. Not a rock. He knew every rock on this farm. Not a piece of equipment, nothing that should be there, a shape. He walked the bank to get a better angle. The morning light was still low and flat, throwing long shadows, and the shape was half buried in the mud. But it was there, long, low, covered in silt and muck, but unmistakably, undeniably, a shape with right angles, human-made right angles. Earl climbed down the bank carefully, boots pressing into clay that held his weight, but wanted to keep his feet. He crossed the basin floor with slow steps, testing each one, and as he got closer, the shape resolved itself into something more specific. The rear corner of a vehicle. He stopped about 10 feet away and stood there looking at it. A car buried in the mud at the bottom of a pond that had been on this property for 61 years. Buried in mud that hadn't seen daylight since before he was born. He had the strangest sensation of the ground shifting under him. Not physically, but in some other way, as though the story of this farm, which he thought he knew every page of, had just opened to a chapter he didn't know existed. He crouched down and looked at what was exposed. Just the rear corner, maybe 18 in of it, a fin or a tail section, chrome trim, and the ghost of a color beneath the silt. Dark, could have been green, could have been black. Hard to say. He put his hand on the metal. Cold, solid, old in the way old metal feels. Not brittle, just deeply, permanently settled into itself. Earl stood up slowly, his knees complaining. He looked around the basin as if someone might be watching. An old reflex, the habit of a man who'd spent a lifetime doing things alone and never expected an audience. No one, just his field, his sky, his farm. He walked back to the house and got his cell phone. The first person he called was his neighbor, Frank Dillard, whose property ran along the eastern fence line and who had lived in Carroll County his whole life. Frank answered on the third ring, groggy and suspicious because calls before 7 on a Saturday were never good news. "There's a car at the bottom of my pond," Earl said. A pause. "Say that again." "Draining the pond to fix the banks." "Found a car buried in the mud. Big one." Another pause, longer this time. "You've been drinking. It's 6:30 in the morning, Frank." "That ain't an answer." "In your family, I haven't been drinking." "Get over here." Frank arrived 20 minutes later in his truck, still pulling on a jacket, a thermos of coffee in his hand, and the look of a man who hadn't entirely decided whether this was worth getting up for. He stood at the bank next to Earl and looked down at the exposed corner of metal. "Well," he said. "Yeah, that's been down there a while." Looks like Frank scratched the back of his neck. "You know what it is?" "Not yet. Need to get more water out." Frank looked at the pump, then at the car, then at Earl. "You've got maybe another 3-4 feet of water over the main body of it. Couple more hours with that pump and we'll see the whole thing." They waited. Frank poured coffee from his thermos, and they sat on the tailgate of Earl's truck and watched the water level drop while the pump ran, and the morning grew around them. Around 8, Frank's wife called, and he told her he'd be home later and didn't explain why, which she apparently accepted because she knew Frank and she knew that when he said later, he meant it. By 9, the water was low enough. Earl waded into the ankle-deep center pool to check the pump intake again. And from out there, he could see the whole silhouette of it now, laying on the basin floor like something sleeping. It was big, even covered in decades of silt and pond mud. The proportions were unmistakable. A full-sized American automobile from an era when American automobiles were made as large as engineering and arrogance could make them. Long, wide fins at the rear that swept upward in that particular style of the late 1950s or early 1960s. 2 doors, a convertible possibly, or a hard top with a long roofline. Frank let out a long breath from the bank. That's not somebody's junk pickup. No, that's a show car, or was. Earl waited back out of the mud and they both stood looking at it. The silence between 2 men who knew each other well enough not to fill silence, for no reason. "How does a car like that end up in a farm pond?" Frank said. "I don't know. Did your father ever say anything?" "No, cut him off. But not unkindly. Never. Not once." Frank rubbed his jaw. "Well, you're going to need to pull it out. I know. Going to be a mess. I know that too." Frank looked at him. "You okay?" Earl considered the question honestly. He was standing at the bottom of a drained pond looking at a vehicle that had apparently been there since before he was alive on land his family had owned for 60 years, and no one had ever told him. Whatever he was okay wasn't quite the right word. "I'll get the chains," he said. The extraction took most of the morning. Earl brought the tractor down the bank on the west side, where the grade was gentler, and the clay had dried out enough in the past few days to hold the tractor's weight without too much concern. He ran heavy logging chains from the tractor's drawbar across the basin floor and worked the hook around the rear axle of the buried car. Frank directed from the bank, calling adjustments as Earl maneuvered. The first pull accomplished nothing except demonstrating that the mud did not want to give up what it had held for 60 years. The chains went taut, The tractor engine climbed in pitch, the rear tires clawed at the clay, and the car sat absolutely still. The earth was not impressed. Earl backed off, repositioned the chains lower on the axle, got a different angle and tried again. This time something moved. Not much, maybe an inch, but the mud made a sound, a low sucking groan that carried across the whole basin like a throat clearing before speech. The chains held tight. Earl kept pressure on, held the tractor at full strength. Another inch, then 3 in, then a foot. The mud released the front end, and with a sound like a cork coming out of a bottle, a sudden pop followed by a rush of dark water that had been trapped underneath. The car slid forward on the basin floor, trailing silt and weeds, its shape becoming clearer with every foot it moved into the lower light. Frank had gone quiet on the bank. He was leaning forward with his hands on his knees, staring. Earl pulled it all the way to the bank, then repositioned the tractor and worked the car up the grade and onto flat ground, mud streaming off it in sheets, leaving dark trails on the clay. When it stopped moving, when the chains went slack and the engine quieted and the mud stopped running, they both just looked at it. Whatever it had been, you could see it now, under the silt and the decades of pond mod. A shape that had once been extraordinary was still there, still coherent, still recognizable as something that had been built with real intention. It was a Buick. Earl couldn't tell the year yet, not with this much mud on it, but the proportions and the work visible at the edges were unmistakably Buick. Late 1950s or very early 1960s, full-sized, a Roadmaster or an Electra or something of that class. One of those cars that had been made when the company was still making statements, when an automobile was supposed to mean something about the person who owned it. Frank walked slowly around it, hands clasped behind his back like he was viewing something in a museum. "Earl?" he said. "Yeah, you know what this is? Tell me." "This is a 59 Buick Electra. Maybe a 60. He stopped at the rear and pointed at the tail fin chrome. "See that fin treatment? That's the Electra 225, the deuce and a quarter." He crouched down and looked at the rocker panel. Twado hardtop. Earl looked at his neighbor. "How do you know that?" Frank stood up. "My uncle had one. Drove it until 1979 when the transmission went and he couldn't afford to fix it." He paused. "I cried when they junked it. I was 11 years old." They stood in silence. "How does one of these end up in your pond?" Frank said again. "I don't know. Your dad buy this place in 63, right?" Frank looked at the car. "So it went in the water before your family owned the property." Earl hadn't gotten that far yet, but Frank was right. His father had bought the land from the estate of a man named Walter Coe, who had farmed it before them. Lester Hadley had dealt with an attorney in Carrollton, the whole transaction distant and businesslike, the previous owner already gone. Earl had never thought much about Walter Coe, or who he had been or what he had left behind. Now, there was apparently a 1959 Buick Electric 225 that used to be his or someone's. Frank's phone buzzed and he looked at it and made a face. "I've got to get back. Margaret's got people coming over at noon." He looked at the car one more time. "You going to be all right?" "I'm fine. You need any help cleaning it up? Call me." Earl nodded. Frank got in his truck and backed down the lane. And then Earl was alone again, with the car and the empty pond basin and the questions that were starting to stack up faster than he could organize. Them. He got the garden hose from the barn and started rinsing. The mud came off slowly. He worked from the top down, the hose pressure cutting channels through the silt, exposing metal by degrees. The roof first, then the windshield frame, then the long hood. The color emerged as he washed. Not black, dark green. A deep specific green that had a particular quality even under all these years of damage. A color that someone had chosen carefully, not an accident. The chrome came up next. Grillwork, headlight rings. The swooping trim along the beltline, that was the signature of the car's era. Excess and confidence made physical. Earl worked for 2 hours without stopping. When most of the exterior mud was off, he stepped back and looked at what he had. The paint was damaged, no question. Oxidized down through the clear coat in dozens of places. Rust blooming in the lower panels, where the water had done its patient work, for decades. The glass was intact, which surprised him. All of it, the windshield, the side windows, the rear glass. The chrome was pitted and grey, but present. The body panels under the rust were straighter than they had any right to be. It was a wreck. It was also undeniably, unmistakably still a car, still itself. He tried the driver's door. It resisted. He put his weight behind it, and something inside moved. Some gasket or seal that had been compressed for 60 years, shifting just enough. And the door opened with a shriek of wet metal on metal. The smell hit him hard. Decades of trapped water, silt, organic matter, the deep cold scent of the bottom of a pond, compressed into the interior of a car. He stepped back and let it breathe for a minute. Then he looked inside. The interior was what you'd expect after 60 years underwater. The seats were gone, essentially reduced to springs and the ghost of their original upholstery, which had long since become part of the silt, covering everything. The dashboard was there, the instrument cluster, the steering wheel, all of it covered in that same grey-brown sediment. The floor was mud, but in the back seat area, on the passenger side, half buried in the silt on the floor, something caught his eye. A box, metal, about the size of a shoebox, but heavier looking with a latch on the front. Earl reached in and tried to pick it up, heavier than it looked. He worked it free from the mud with both hands and carried it out into the light. He set it on the hood of the Buick and looked at it. The latch was sealed with rust, but the box itself was solid. The kind of thing made to survive exactly this. He got a screwdriver from the toolbox on the tractor and worked the latch, prying carefully, not forcing it. It took a few minutes. Then the latch gave. Earl lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had kept the water out for 60 years, were papers, and beneath the papers, something else, something that caught the weak morning light, and held it. He stood there at the side of his drained pond, the empty farm around him, the pump still running its steady diesel note, and looked at what the water had been keeping. His hands were not entirely steady when he reached inside. He lifted the oilcloth bundle out first, set it carefully on the hood beside the box. Then he reached back in for what was underneath. His fingers closed around something hard and smooth and impossibly cold. He pulled it out and held it in the light. A coin, gold-colored, heavy for its size, the face of it worn, but legible. He turned it over. The back showed an eagle spread wings, the kind of design he vaguely recognized from history books. He turned it back, over. The date was stamped clearly, 1927. He set it down very carefully on the hood next to the oilcloth, as though it might break. It did not look like a novelty coin. It did not look like something you bought at a tourist shop. It looked like something that had been made by a government at a time, when governments still made things to last. He reached into the box again. Another coin, same size, same weight, same cold. 1924, another 1928. He kept going until he had laid out 9 of them in a row on the hood of the Buick. 9 gold coins in a line on a car that had been at the bottom of a pond for 60 years on a farm in Carroll County, Ohio. And Earl Hadley stood in his muddy boots and looked at them and did not know what to say to himself. He picked up the oilcloth bundle and unwrapped it carefully. The old cloth, stiff and dark with age but intact, the oil in it having done exactly what it was meant to do. Inside was a smaller wrapped package paper over something flat, and beneath that, a folded piece of paper, a letter handwritten in ink that had aged to brown, but was still perfectly legible. He unfolded the letter slowly. The handwriting was precise. The kind of handwriting that people had in generations that were taught penmanship as a serious subject, each letter formed with care and conviction. It began, "If you are reading this, then something went wrong that I could not prevent." Earl read it twice. Standing there in the morning light with the empty pond basin behind him and the coins lined up on the hood and 60 years of buried questions trying to surface all at once. Then he folded the letter again, very carefully put it back in the oilcloth and put the oilcloth back in the box and latched the box shut. He went inside and called his daughter Macy. She answered on the second ring, Sunday morning voice relaxed, expecting the usual brief check-in. "Hey Dad, you're up early?" "I'm always up early. I know what's going on." He sat down at the kitchen table. The box was in front of him. He was still in his mud-caked boots, which Linda would have had words about, but Linda wasn't here. "I drained the pond," he said. "Yeah, you told me you were going to do that. How'd it go?" "Found a car." A pause. "You found a car. 1959 Buick Electra. Tuodo hardtop in the mud at the bottom." Another pause. Longer. "Dad, there's more. How is there more than a car in the pond?" "There was a box inside the car. Metal box sealed. Had 9 gold coins in it and a letter. The silence on the other end had a different quality now. Not disbelief exactly, more like the pause of someone making sure they were fully awake before continuing a conversation. What kind of gold coins? American? I don't know exactly. Dates from the 20s. And a letter handwritten says he stopped. You should come out and read it yourself. Dad, I'm in Cleveland. I know where you are. She was quiet for a moment. He could hear her thinking, is this real? Like, is this actually happening? I'm sitting at the kitchen table with mud on my boots and the box in front of me. Macy, another pause. Then I'll be there by noon. He made himself eat something. A bowl of cereal standing at the counter. More because he knew he should than because he was hungry. He looked out the window at the empty pond basin, pale and wide in the growing morning light. The dark shape of the Buick, visible from this distance as just a shadow at the edge of the slope. His pond, his farm, his father's farm, his father, who had never in 40 years of conversations about this land mentioned anything about a car or a box or 9 gold coins or any kind of secret buried in the ground. He went back outside and walked the perimeter of the basin while the pump continued its work in the last shallow puddle at the center. He wanted to look at the car again in the daylight. Now that the mud was off it, now that he could see what it actually was, it was something that was certain even in its current state, covered in the damage of decades. The Buick had a presence. The lines of it were still coherent, still carrying whatever intention had gone into their design. The long hood, the wide stance, the tail fins that swept up at the back, and that optimistic upward gesture that said more about the decade that made them than about any practical consideration. Somebody had bought this car when it was new, and it had been an event. You didn't buy a 1959 Buick Electric 225 because you needed transportation. You bought it because you wanted people to understand something about you. Earl ran his hand along the hood slowly, the way you'd run a hand along a horse's flank. The metal was solid under the rust, cold in the morning air. He thought about Walter Coe. Earl knew almost nothing about the man who had owned this farm before his family. He knew the name from the deed. He knew the transaction had been handled through an estate, which meant Walter Coe had died without clear heirs who hadn't wanted the land. He knew his father had paid $11,000 for the property in 1963, which had been a serious amount of money for Lester Hadley at the time. Beyond that, nothing. He went to the house and got the old metal filing cabinet from the back bedroom, the one that had his father's documents in it, the stuff he'd never had reason to look through very carefully. Deed abstracts, old tax records, the original purchase agreement from 1963. He carried the whole drawer out to the kitchen table and started going through it. The original deed was there, typed on paper that had gone the yellow of old newspaper, Carroll County, Ohio. The grantor was listed as the estate of Walter Coe, administered by an attorney named R.H. Peaton, whose office had been in Carrollton. The date was April 14th, 1963. Earl looked at the date on the letter he'd found in the box. He'd only glanced at it before folding it away, but he'd registered the date at the top, October 1961. The car had gone into the pond sometime between October 1961 and April 1963. Probably closer to 1961 or 1962, given the letter put there by Walter Coe, or by someone on Walter Coe's behalf, or put there for reasons Earl could not yet understand. He set the deed aside and looked through the rest of the drawer. More tax records, a receipt for a tractor, his parents' original mortgage documents. At the very bottom, a small envelope he'd never noticed before. Brown with age, his father's name on the front, and handwriting he didn't recognize. He opened it. Inside was a single index card, handwritten, a short paragraph in an older man's shaky script. Mr. Hadley, you bought good land. There are things about the northwest corner I should have told you. I was a coward, and I didn't. If you drain the pond, you will understand. I am sorry, take care of it. R. Petton. Earl sat with the card in his hand for a long time. R.H. Petton. The attorney who had handled the sale, the man who had processed the deed in the estate and handed Lester Hadley the keys, and never said another word about any of this. He was sorry. The morning had turned fully bright by now. The thin clouds burning off to let the sun come through, the light washing over the empty pond basin in broad pale sheets. Earl put the index card in his shirt pocket. He put the original deed back in the drawer. He went outside and stood at the edge of the basin and looked at the Buick. He was 53 years old. He had worked this land for 32 years after his father died. He had walked every inch of it in every season, had repaired every fence post until every field, and worried about every dry summer and wet spring. He thought he knew this place the way you knew a person you'd lived with for a long time. Macy arrived at 11:50, which meant she'd been driving fast, which she always did when something engaged her. She was 31 years old and had her mother's eyes in Earl's stubbornness, in a job in Cleveland, doing something with urban planning that he didn't entirely understand, but that seemed to suit her. She came up the lane in her small SUV, parked behind the tractor, and got out already looking toward the pond. She didn't hug him first, just looked at the car. "Dad, I know that's real, that's what I said." She walked toward it with her hands in her jacket pockets, circling it the way Frank had, taking it in from every angle. How does something like this not just disintegrate after 60 years underwater? The mud protected it, sealed it in, and it was built when they still built things to last. She ran a finger along the chrome of the passenger side door. It's incredible. Even like this. She looked up at him. "Did you look up what these are worth?" He hadn't. He hadn't had his phone in his hand for that purpose since before the morning started. "No, Dad." She pulled out her phone and started typing. While she looked, Earl got the box from the kitchen table and brought it out. He set it on the hood between them and opened it. Macy looked up from her phone and went still. She looked at the coins in their row, then picked one up, held it to the light, turned it over. "These are St. Gaudens," she said. "I don't know what that means. Double Eagle gold coins, $20 face value, named after the sculptor who designed them." She looked at her phone. They stopped making them in 1933. These she picked up the one dated 1927. The pre-1933 gold eagles. Depending on condition and specific year, they go for she stopped. "What?" She looked up. "Dad, a common date pre-1933 double eagle in average circulated condition goes for around $2,000. Earl says nothing a better date or better condition could be significantly more, and there are 9 of them." He looked at the coins. She looked at the coins. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "That's not all of it," he said. She looked at him. He handed her the oilcloth bundle. "There's a letter inside. Read it." She unwrapped it carefully, the same carefulness he'd used, treating it like what it was, something that had been waiting a long time to be read. She unfolded the paper and read it in silence, lips moving slightly over certain words. When she finished, she looked up and her expression was different. Something had shifted behind her eyes. "Earl," she said, and she only called him that when something was serious. "You need to understand what you're sitting on. Tell me." She looked at the letter. This man, whoever he wasn't just hiding coins. He was hiding proof of something. The letter talks about records, documents. She turned it over. It says he had more. That the car was just the first part. That there was a second location. Earl felt the ground shift under him again. That same sensation from earlier. The story of the farm opening to another chapter. What second location? He said it doesn't say clearly. He describes a place on the property by reference to something I don't know what to make of. She pointed to a line near the bottom of the letter. The oak past the stone fence at the field's far corner where I buried the years. He says that's where the rest is. Earl turned and looked east toward the far end of the property where the old stone fence ran along the boundary, the one his father had rebuilt sections of in 1974, and that Earl had been maintaining since. There were several oaks along that fence line. Mature trees, old ones, the kind that had been there long enough that you stopped seeing them as anything other than permanent features of the landscape. He looked at his daughter. She looked at him. "We're going to need shovels," she said. But they didn't go right away. Macy insisted on doing more research first. Said it would be foolish to do anything else with either the coins or the car until they understood what they had. She sat at his kitchen table with her laptop and spent 2 hours going down every research path she could find, while Earl made sandwiches and coffee and tried not to watch the clock. What she found filled in the shape of it slowly, the way the car had emerged from the mud, piece by piece, becoming more recognizable the more the silt came off. Walter Coe had been a real person. There was a thin record of him in Carroll County archives from the 1940s and 1950s. He had owned the farm, had run cattle and some row crop operation, had lived alone as far as anyone could tell. The county property tax records showed the farm going to the estate of Walter Coe in November 1961, which was consistent with the date on the letter. Walter Coe had died in November 1961. He had died, the brief obituary notice in the Carrollton Free Press said, of a heart attack survived by no immediate family. His estate had been administered by R.H. Pemberton attorney. The attorney who had written the index card, the attorney who had told Lester Hadley he'd been a coward. Macy found R.H. Pemberton in a different database. Robert Harold Peaton, attorney at law, Carrollton, Ohio. Born 1908, died in 1987. He had outlived the sale of the farm by 24 years. And in those 24 years, he had apparently never told anyone what he knew, except for that single index card addressed to Lester Hadley, which Lester Hadley had put in the bottom of a filing drawer and apparently never opened. Earl went and got the card again and read it one more time. You bought good land. There are things about the northwest corner I should have told you. I was a coward, and I didn't. If you drain the pond, you will understand. His father had never drained the pond, had never needed to. Not the way Earl had. The banks hadn't been a problem in Lester's time, or if they had been, he'd managed it differently. The pump, the excavation, the draining down to bare mud. None of that had happened in his father's tenure. So, the index card had sat in the drawer, its meaning opaque, addressed to a man who might read it someday and know what it meant. But Lester Hadley had apparently not known what it meant, or had decided not to pursue it. And then Lester Hadley had died and the card had passed to Earl along with everything else, buried under 40 years of other paperwork and paid off receipts. Earl thought about his father, about the man who had bought this farm and built a life on it and left it to his son with a simple instruction. Don't sell it. He had always assumed his father meant that because of sentiment, because the land was theirs, and Hadleys didn't give things up. But now he wondered if his father had known. On some level, he couldn't quite articulate that the land held more than what was visible, that there was a reason to hold on that went beyond sentiment, or maybe Lester Hadley had been exactly what he appeared, a hard-working man who bought a piece of ground and worked it for 40 years without ever knowing what was under the pond in the northwest corner, decided to believe that it was easier, and it was probably true. Macy said from the table, "Come look at this," she'd found an auction record of 1933 St. Godin's Double Eagle Common Date VF condition sold for $2,300 at a coin auction in Columbus 3 months ago. 9 of those is over $20,000, she said. And that's if they're common dates in average condition. If any of these are scarcer dates, or if the condition held better than average inside that sealed box, the number goes up. Earl sat down across from her in the car. She pulled up another page. A 1959 Buick Electra 225 two-door hardtop unrested sold at a barn find auction in Michigan last year. The final price made Earl's stomach drop. $47, unrested as found condition. A restored example, Macy said quietly. If someone put serious work into it, it could go considerably higher. The right buyer, the right auction house. She stopped. Dad, this is not nothing. Earl looked at his hands. The same hands that had been holding wrenches and fence posts and cattle halters for 30 years on a farm that had been slowly losing ground to time and bad luck and thin margins and all the ordinary disasters of agricultural life. We haven't even looked at the rest of it, he said. The letter talks about more. Macy closed the laptop. Then we should go look. The afternoon light was coming in at a long angle when they walked the east fence line, the two of them moving through the dry grass with a shovel each, looking at the oak trees that grew along the old stone fence with different eyes than Earl had ever used on them before. There were 4 oaks in that area. 3 of them were grouped together about midway along the fence. The 4th stood alone at the far corner, bigger than the others, its trunk spreading wide in the way trees grew when they'd had decades of uncontested space. Earl stopped when he reached it. The stone fence made a right angle at this corner of the property. 2 lines of field stone meeting at 90 degrees. The stones drists stacked in the old way without mortar, the kind of construction that lasted because of patience and weight rather than chemistry. The oak grew at the inside of that corner, its roots running both ways along the fence lines underground. He looked at the base of the tree. The ground there was undisturbed on the surface, no obvious sign of digging. But the letter had said buried, and 60 years of weather and leaf fall and root growth would have covered any evidence long ago. Earl picked a spot about 3 feet from the base of the trunk on the south side where the roots were less dense and started digging. It was hard work. The ground was dry and packed, full of small rocks, and the oak roots ran through it in every direction, forcing him to cut around them. Macy worked beside him on a parallel line. Not talking, both of them focused on the ground. At 14 in, Earl's shovel hit something that wasn't rock and wasn't root. He stopped, got down on his knees, used his hands to clear the soil away from around whatever he'd hit. The thing was metal, larger than the box he'd found in the car, and wrapped in what looked like heavy canvas or oilcloth, similar to what had been inside the first container. He looked up at Macy. He cleared more soil with his hands, working carefully, not wanting to damage whatever was wrapped inside. The package was about the size of 2 stacked shoeboxes, heavy, wrapped tight, in multiple layers of oilcloth that had been tied with wire rather than cord. The wire had rusted through in places, but the oilcloth had held. The whole thing had been buried deep enough to be below the frost line, which explained why it had survived this long in reasonable condition. He lifted it free from the ground and set it on the stone fence. His hands were shaking again. He noticed this without judgment. It seemed like an appropriate response. He unwrapped it slowly, Macy standing beside him, both of them silent in the late afternoon light, with the oak tree overhead and the old stone fence at their backs. The oilcloth came away in layers. Inside the first layer was a second layer, and inside that was a metal container similar to the first but larger. And this one had a combination lock that had long since rusted into place. Earl looked at it, looked at the lock, got the screwdriver from his jacket pocket, and went to work on the latch. The lock didn't yield, but the latch itself, the hardware it was attached to, was older and softer than the lock. And after several minutes of careful work, it gave the screws, pulling free from the metal, the whole mechanism coming loose as a unit, leaving the lid free to open without needing the combination at all. He lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped again in oilcloth, was a stack of papers, and beside the papers, a second bundle, heavier, that shifted with a sound when he moved it. A soft, dense, sliding sound. Macy put her hand on his arm. He unwrapped the second bundle. More coins, not 9 this time. These were stacked in rolls, old paper coin rolls gone brittle with age. 6 of them. And when he carefully unwrapped the first roll and counted what fell into his palm, there were 20 coins, each one gold. Each one stamped with the same eagle and the same design as the 9 in the box from the car. He counted the rolls, 6 rolls of 20 coins each. 120 coins. He looked at Macy, she looked at him. 120 pre. 1933 St. Gaudens double eagles, buried in oilcloth at the base of an oak tree, at the corner of a farm in Carroll County, Ohio, for 60 years. If they averaged $2,000 each, that was $240,000. If some of the dates were scarcer, or the condition ran better than average in that sealed container, the number could be meaningfully higher. Earl sat down on the stone fence because his legs felt uncertain. Macy sat down next to him. The farm stretched around them, quiet and ordinary in the way. Farms were quiet in the late afternoon. The light going gold across the fields. A crow calling somewhere in the distance. The pump still running its diesel note back at the pond. "Dad," Macy said very quietly, "I know this changes things." He looked at the coins in his palm. The sunlight catching the gold, the way sunlight catches gold, with a particular warmth that didn't belong to any other metal. "I need to understand what all of this is," he said. "The coins, the car, the letter. There's a story here that I don't have all of yet." "I know." He folded his fingers over the coins. "But tonight, I'm going to sit on the porch with a beer and think about your grandfather." Macy looked at him. "He told me not to sell this land," Earl said. "I always thought I knew why." He looked down at his closed fist at the old gold pressing into his palm with 60 years of patient wait. Maybe he knew more than I gave him credit for. The crow called again, farther away this time, its voice moving off across the fields. The pump ran steadily at the pond. The Buick sat at the edge of the empty basin, dark green and impossible in the evening light, waiting for whatever came next. Earl stood up and put the coins carefully back in the container and lashed it shut. There was more to find. He knew that now. The letter had said the car was the first part, and this had been the second. But something in the way the letter was written, something he'd been turning over since that morning, suggested there was more still. The man who had written those words had been careful, deliberate. He had not put everything in one place. Earl carried the container back toward the house, Macy walking beside him. The farm looked the same as it always had. Same fields, same fences, same old barn with the second floorboards that needed replacing. Same house where his father had eaten breakfast every morning for 40 years. But it wasn't the same farm he'd walked out onto this morning in the dark. Something had come up from the bottom of that pond. And it wasn't just a car. Tomorrow, there would be phone calls to make, experts to consult, decisions to work through about what all of this meant. Legally, historically, practically. His life was about to get complicated. In a way that farm life didn't usually get complicated. But tonight, he walked his own land in the fading light, and felt for the first time, and longer than he could easily remember, like the ground under his feet was solid. Sunday came in cold and overcast, the sky the color of a tin roof with a wind off. The northeast pushed dead leaves across the lane in small dry rushes. Earl was up at 4:30 again. The alarm went off, and he reached for it in the dark, and then lay still for a moment, listening to the farm settled around him the way old houses did in the cold, creaking and adjusting, accustomed to the weight of the years. He made coffee. He sat at the kitchen table with the two metal containers in front of him, the small one from the car and the larger one from the oak tree, both latched shut, both patient in the way objects were patient, holding their contents without urgency, as though they had not spent 60 years underground and could easily spend 60 more. He opened the small one and took out the letter again. He had read it 3 times. Now, each time he had absorbed it more fully, the way you absorbed a complicated piece of news. The first time for the facts, the second for what lay under the facts, the third for what the writer had been trying to say between the lines. The man who had written it was named Walter Coe. Earl knew that now because the letter was signed at the bottom in the same precise handwriting that ran through every line. Not Walter, just W. Coe, as though even in a private letter addressed to no one yet. He was still conducting himself formally. The letter read in full. This, then something went wrong that I could not prevent. I write this on October 14th, 1961, in the awareness that my health will not carry me much further and that I have made arrangements poorly where I should have made them carefully. The coins in this box are genuine, all of them pre-1933 Saint. God's double eagles acquired legally between 1934 and 1938, when gold ownership was still permitted for numismatic purposes under the executive order. A further quantity is buried at the oak in the east corner. Both caches together represent what I was able to set aside over 20 years from the sale of timber rights and cattle converted to gold, because I did not trust what I could see happening to paper money or to institutions that held it. There is a third matter, and it is the one that troubles me most. In the barn in the northwest corner under the board floor of the old tack room, there is an iron chest. What is inside that chest is not mine. I was asked that to hold it by a man I trusted, and I have held it for 11 years, and now I am dying, and there is no one to give it back to, because the man who asked me is himself dead. I do not know the full nature of what is inside. I know only that it was important enough that a man I respected asked me to protect it, and that it has remained here untouched since 1950. I was a private man. I have no heirs. I ask only that whoever finds this treats what they find with the same care with which it was kept. The land is good land. Treat it accordingly. W. Coe Earl read it again. Then he put it back in the box and closed the lid. The barn. He looked toward the window. The sky was still dark, the sun not up yet, the farm invisible except for the shapes his memory supplied. He had been in that barn 10,000 times. The old tack room in the northwest corner, the one he used now for storing and hand tools, small equipment, and because the original purpose was gone. The farm hadn't run horses since his father's time. The floor in there was original plank, wide pine boards gone grey with age. He had never looked under them. He got his jacket off the hook by the door and went outside into the cold dark with a flashlight. The barn smelled the way it always smelled. Hay and animal and old wood, and the particular mineral sharpness of aged metal. He moved through it with the ease of a man who had navigated it in every condition. Light and dark, sober and exhausted, calm and panicked. The cattle stirred in their stalls as he passed. A few heads turning, the soft sound of hooves on bedding. The tack room was in the northwest corner, a small enclosed space about 10 feet 12. Its door on a wooden hinge that he'd repaired twice over the years. He pushed it open and shone the flashlight inside. The floor was wide pine planking, just as he'd always seen it for boards across running the length of the room, worn smooth in the center where people had walked, and rougher at the edges where they hadn't. He crouched and ran the light along the seams between the boards in the northwest corner of the room, the corner that matched what the letter described. He found it 2 boards shorter than the rest, their ends not running to the wall, but stopping about 8 in short of it. The gap between those boards and the wall was filled with old dried mud, the kind that accumulated over decades. But underneath the mud, barely visible in the flashlight beam, a piece of iron, a ring handle set flush into the wood, the same as the trapdoor in the story he'd read in those books as a boy, the same as every hidden thing in every old building. He pulled the ring. The boards came up as a unit, a section of flooring hinged together at some point in the past. The hinge itself below the surface, invisible from above. Under them was a space about 3 feet deep, lined with flat stones laid without mortar, a small dry chamber that had been built with real intention and maintained by the simple virtue of being left alone. The iron chest was there. It was about the size of a large suitcase, flat-topped, riveted at the corners with 2 hasps on the front that had been padlocked. The padlocks were old, the same vintage as everything else on this property, and both of them had rusted in the closed position. The locks themselves were probably still functional inside the rust, but it didn't matter. The hasps they were attached to had pulled loose from the wood of the chest at some point, the wood having shrunk and swelled over 60 years until the screws lost their bite. And now there, has hung open on the locks, while the chest lid sat free. Earl sat back on his heels and looked at it. He thought about the letter, a man I trusted. I have held it for 11 years. It has remained here untouched since 1950. Something placed in this chest in 1950, held by Walter Coe until his death in 1961, undiscovered for 60 years since. He went back to the house and woke Macy. She was sleeping in her old room, the one that had been hers when she visited as a child, the room with the window that looked east over the fields. She came awake quickly, the way people did when they knew something was in motion. "The barn," he said. "There's a third one." She was dressed and outside in 4 minutes. They carried the chest out of the tack room together, each taking a side, the weight of it significant but manageable. They set it on the workbench in the main barn aisle where the light was better, and Earl had a proper work lamp he could bring to bear. Macy looked at the hasps. The locks are seized. Locks are still attached to the hasps. Hasps pulled out of the wood. He lifted one hasp and showed her lids free. She looked at the chest. He looked at the chest. "Do you want to?" she started. "Yeah." He lifted the lid. Inside, the chest was divided into 2 sections by a wooden partition running lengthwise. On the left side, wrapped in what had once been a canvas bag, but was now mostly held together by the shape of what it contained, was a stack of rectangular objects. On the right side, taking up the full depth of the section, were 2 wooden cases of the kind used to ship fragile things, each one sealed with wooden slats and small nails. Earl lifted one of the rectangular objects from the left side and unwrapped the canvas carefully. It was a bar, rectangular, flat on top and bottom, slightly tapered on the sides, heavy in a way that was disproportionate to its size, the weight landing in his hands with a density that had no equivalent in ordinary life. On the top face, stamped into the metal, a series of marks, a serial number, a purity grade, and the logo of a refinery he didn't recognize. The metal was the color of old brass, but it wasn't brass. He knew the weight, he knew the color, he knew what that particular warmth in his hands meant. He set it on the workbench. "Macy," he said. She had been watching him? Her voice came out very controlled, the way voices did when the speaker was actively managing their own reaction. "How many are in there?" He counted the shapes still in the canvas. "Looks like 6, maybe 8 total." She picked up the bar he'd set down, turned it over, read the serial number, looked at the purity stamp. "This is a gold bar," she said. "I know, Dad." She set it down with the same careful precision he'd used, placing it rather than putting it. A standard gold bar, a 400 troy ounce bar. is worth somewhere around $800,000 at current prices. Earl looked at the bar on the workbench. These don't look like 400 bars, Macy continued, voice still controlled. These look smaller. Maybe 100 bars, but 100 O of gold is still. She stopped and did the math on her phone. Her face did something complicated. Around $260,000 each. He counted the shapes in the canvas again. 8. He did not do the arithmetic out loud. Neither did she. They both just let the numbers settle in the air of the old barn, while the cattle shifted in their stalls and the wind moved against the roof. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Earl turned to the right side of the chest, the 2 wooden cases. He pried the slats off the first one carefully, not wanting to damage whatever was inside. Nestled in straw packing that had dried to a crackling mass over 60 years were 6 bottles, glass bottles, dark green, sealed with wax over the corks. Each one labeled in handwriting he didn't recognize. Not Coe's precise script, but something looser, faster. He picked one up. The label read Chateau Petrus, 1928, with a handwritten notation beneath Palmer Metello Chateau. The second case held 8 more bottles, similarly packed, similarly labeled, different vintages. 1929, 1934, 1945. Earl set the last bottle down carefully. He had grown up on a farm in eastern Ohio. His experience with wine extended to the bottle of Merlot he bought at the grocery store in Carrollton every few months when he felt like something other than beer. He did not know what Chateau Petrus was. He suspected, given the pattern of everything else he'd found on this farm in the past 24 hours, that the answer to that question was going to be significant. He went inside and got his phone. Macy was already on hers. The results came back within a minute. She read them without speaking for a long moment. Then she looked up. Chateau Petrus is one of the most valuable wineries in the world. She said, the 1945 vintage is considered one of the greatest wines ever made. At auction, a single bottle of 1945 Petrus in good condition has sold for. She stopped. Tell me. $43,000. The barn was very quiet. There are 14 bottles total, he said. I know. She looked back at her phone, scrolling. The 1928 and 1929 are also exceptional years. Less famous than the 45, but still. She shook her head. We need an expert. We can't value these accurately ourselves. The condition matters enormously. The provenance matters. Earl looked at everything spread on the workbench. The gold bar, the bottles in their straw, the chest sitting open behind them. He thought about the letter. What is inside that chest is not mine. I was asked to hold it by a man I trusted. Who does this belong to? He said. Macy looked at him. The letter says it's not Coe. Someone gave it to him to hold in 1950. That someone is dead now. Does that mean it passes to whoever finds it? Does it mean the estate of that person has a claim? Does it mean the state of Ohio has a claim? He rubbed the back of his neck. I need a lawyer, yes, she said. You do, but not just any lawyer. You need someone who handles estate law and property law and knows something about found property and abandoned assets. She paused. And you need to do this right, not because of what it's worth, because of what happens if you don't do it right. He nodded. She was correct. He had seen enough of other people's mistakes over the years to know that the way you handled the windfall mattered as much as the windfall itself. People who came into unexpected money and handled it carelessly ended up in court. Or worse, people who moved too fast or too quietly, who didn't account for the legal dimensions of found property, gave themselves problems that lasted longer than the money. Call your mother, he said. Macy looked surprised. Why? Because she's a smart woman and she has good judgment, and I should have trusted it more when we were married. He paused. And because she's going to find out anyway, better, she hears it from us. Macy was going to have, for a moment, offense. She always had opinions, most of them were right. He put everything back in the chest, covered it with a moving blanket from the corner of the barn, and carried it into the house and locked it in the back bedroom closet. The 2 metal containers from the pond and the oak tree went on the shelf next to it. He locked the closet with the key he'd had for 20 years and put the key in his shirt pocket next to the index card from the attorney. Then he went to the kitchen and made more coffee because it was not yet 7 in the morning and the day had already become something he needed to be fully awake for. Word got out the way things always got out in small places. Not because Earl said anything to anyone, but because Frank Dillard had been there Saturday morning and Frank Dillard's wife, Margaret, talked to her sister on Sunday afternoons, and her sister lived next to Ray Dunar, who owned the hardware store in town and talked to everyone. By Monday morning, Earl had 3 voicemail messages from people he barely knew asking if it was true that he'd found treasure in his pond. By Tuesday, a man he'd never met had driven out the lane unannounced and knocked on the door to ask if he wanted to sell the property. Earl stood in the doorway and looked at the man, late 40s. The particular kind of confidence that came from money, and the expectation that money would be persuasive. "Place isn't for sale," Earl said. "I'm prepared to offer significantly above market value for the acreage. It's not for sale at any price." The man's expression adjusted itself. Recalculating. "I understand you've had some interesting discoveries on the property. My clients have a specific interest in the historical significance of who are your clients?" A pause. "I'm not at liberty to say." Earl looked at him for a moment. "You drove out here without an appointment to make an unsolicited offer on behalf of clients. You won't name on a property where you know something was recently found, that about, right?" The man's smile stayed in place but went thinner. "I'd encourage you to consider the offer seriously before Earl closed the door." He stood in the hallway and listened to the man's car back down the lane. Then he called Macy. "Someone came to the house," he said. "Wouldn't say who sent him. Wanted to buy the property." "How did he know about the fines?" Frank's wife told her sister. "Dad, I know. We need to move faster on the legal side." "I know that too." She had already done preliminary research on lawyers. She had a name, a woman named Claire Ashford, who practiced in Canton, about 40 miles west of Carrollton, who specialized in estate law and had a documented background in found property cases. Macy had read through her firm's website and several case summaries that were publicly available and decided she was the one. They drove to Canton Wednesday morning, Earl and his better jacket. Macy with a folder of documents she'd organized the night before. The coins and the letter, copies of the deed abstract, the index card from the attorney, photographs of everything on her phone. She had printed the photographs on copy paper at the library in Carrollton before they left, a stack of them in a manila envelope, because she believed in paper and her father believed in her. The drive took 40 minutes on US 30, the highway running west through the flat bottom of the valley, with farmland on both sides. Field corn already cut down to stubble. Earl drove. He had forgotten how much she resembled her mother in that particular combination of preparation and contained, nervous energy. Linda had always done that too, checked everything twice. He had not spoken to Linda since Monday, when Macy had called her as he'd asked. Linda had responded, according to Macy, with silence and then a single sentence. "Tell your father to be careful." Earl had turned that sentence over a few times. It was exactly the kind of thing Linda would say. It was also, he thought, exactly the right thing. Claire Ashford was 50 or so, with reading glasses. She took us to on and off in a way that suggested she was always about 15% more focused than she appeared. Her office was on the 4th floor of a building on Market Avenue. Neat and organized in the way that said the person who worked there liked having control over their environment. The desk was clear, except for a legal pad, a pen, and a glass of water. The bookshelf behind her was organized by subject, and then by author within each subject. Earl noticed these things, the way he noticed everything quietly, without comment, adding them to his understanding of who he was dealing with. She had them sit. She poured water from a picture on the credenza. She took out a fresh legal pad and wrote the date at the top. She listened without interrupting. When Earl finished, she made a few notes and then looked at the photographs on Macy's phone, scrolling through them methodically, pausing on some and moving quickly past others. She asked to see the prints and went through those more slowly. When she finished, she set them in a neat stack on the corner of the desk and looked at Earl directly. "All right," she said. "A few things you need to understand right away." She put her reading glasses on. Gold found on private property in Ohio, coins, bars, any form, belongs to the property owner unless it can be demonstrated that a specific prior owner retained legal claim to it. The estate of Walter Coe had no known heirs and was fully dissolved through the 1963 probate process. Whatever Coe owned when he died, and whatever he buried on that property before he died, passed effectively to the land itself. When your father purchased the land, he purchased everything attached to or buried within it. Earl looked at Macy. Macy looked at Earl. However, Claire continued, the letter complicates the portion in the iron chest. The letter explicitly states that those contents were not Coe's property, but were entrusted to him by a third party. That creates what we call a bailment. Coe was holding property for someone else. When the boar, the person who gave it to him, died without retrieving it, and when Coe subsequently died without returning it, the question becomes whether the rightful heir of the original owner can assert a claim after 60 years. Macy said statutes of limitations vary depending on how the claim is framed. In Ohio, a claim based on fraud or concealment can survive longer than a standard property claim. She tapped her pen on the notepad. That said, you have no obligation to proactively identify the original owner. You are not a detective, and you are not a receiver of stolen goods. What you are is a property owner who found something on your land. The appropriate path is full disclosure. You report the find to the county. You get everything properly appraised and documented, and you let the legal process determine if anyone has a superior claim. And if no one does, then it's yours. The words sat in the room, yours. Earl thought about Frank Dillard's expression when he first saw the car, thought about the man who'd come to the door without a name, thought about the index card at the bottom of the filing drawer, thought about his father working this land for 40 years and dying not knowing what was under the northwest corner of the pond. There's something else, he said. He told her about the man who'd come to the house. Claire's expression didn't change exactly, but it sharpened. She took off her reading glasses and leaned forward slightly. Did he give you any contact information? Left before I could ask. When you say he referenced the historical significance of what you found, did he use those words specifically? Earl thought back pretty close to that. Said his clients had a specific interest in the historical significance. Claire was quiet for a moment. That's an odd phrase to use about a car and some coins. Historical significance implies records, documents, something that matters beyond monetary value. She looked at him. Is there anything in the letter or among the papers you found that suggests the contents of the chest might have historical or political significance beyond the gold and the wine? Earl sat with that question. He thought about the letter again. It has remained here untouched since 1950. I know only that it was important enough that a man I respected asked me to protect it. He thought about the date. 1950, the year after the war had ended 5 years prior. The year the Korean conflict started. A strange hinge in American history when the world was still sorting itself out after one catastrophe before walking into another. The letter says Coe was asked to hold the chest by a man he trusted who later died. Earl said he doesn't name the man. He doesn't describe the contents beyond saying they're not his. But he specifically says he didn't know the full nature of what was inside. Claire was writing, which implies he might have known the partial nature. That's what I keep coming back to. Have you opened everything inside the chest? He had burnt both wooden cases and found the bottles. He had partially unwrapped the gold bars, but hadn't counted them precisely or examined them individually. He had not looked carefully at whether there was anything else in the chest, any paperwork or additional items he might have missed in the initial shock of the discovery. He realized now that he hadn't. He drove back to Carroll County that afternoon with his mind running 2 tracks. The legal track, which Claire had given him a clear path through, was manageable. Report the find, get appraisals, document everything, file the appropriate paperwork with the county, let the system process it. It was work, but it was clear work. The other track was less clear. Someone had sent a man to his door within 48 hours of the story leaking through, Frank Dillard's wife. Someone who knew enough to be interested and who either wouldn't or couldn't say who they were. Someone who specifically referenced historical significance, not dollar value, not collectible value, but historical significance. That phrase kept turning over. He got home before 5. Macy had stayed behind to handle some work commitments remotely from the house, and she was at the kitchen table with her laptop open when he came in. I need to go through the chest again, he said more carefully this time. She closed the laptop. They carried the chest out to the kitchen table and opened it under the overhead light. Earl removed everything methodically this time, setting each object on the table and examining it before moving to the next. The gold bars first. He unwrapped all 8 of them and laid them in a row. Each one bore a serial number and a refinery mark. He photographed every mark. The refinery name was stamped clearly on each bar. Johnson Matthew, London. In a same mark he didn't recognize, and a purity grade of 99.99. Below the serial number on each bar, a secondary stamp he hadn't noticed in the barn. The letters WD, followed by a 4-digit number, WD, War Department. He photographed the stamp. He moved to the wine cases. He had already noted the labels. He went back through them now more carefully, looking at each bottle front and back, noting the condition of the wax seals. Checking for anything written on the glass or on the back labels. On the 5th bottle, he found something. A small paper label adhesive, yellowed and barely attached, pasted to the back of the bottle below the main label. On it, in the same loose handwriting as the original labels, a name and a date. The name was Raymond Howell. The date was November 12th, 1949. He photographed. Then he checked every other bottle. 3 more of them had the same type of back label, same name and date. All November 1949. The 1945 Petrus and the 3 1934 bottles. The remaining 10 bottles had no back label. Either the labels had been lost over 60 years or only those 4 had ever been marked. He set the bottles back in their straw and turned to Macy. Raymond Howell. He said she was already searching. It took longer than the coin research had. The name was not uncommon. There were several Raymond Howells in Ohio records, in Kentucky records, in national archives accessible through genealogical databases. She narrowed it by era and by geography, looking for someone who would have been of an age to serve in World War II and would have had some connection to Carroll County or the surrounding area. She found him in a federal contractor registry from 1947. Raymond James Howell, born 1914, listed as an independent procurement contractor operating under contract to the Army's European Theater Logistics Command between 1945 and 1948. No other details in the public record. No obituary she could find. No other appearances in any database she had access to. He had been there, and then he had apparently stopped being anywhere that left a trace. Then he went back to the chest itself, empty now, and looked at the construction of it. Heavy iron sides and bottom, flat iron lid, the wooden lining inside that was still intact despite 6 decades. He ran his hand along the bottom of the interior, pressing the wooden panels, and on the 3rd panel from the left he found it. A slight give, a panel that was not fixed in place but was resting on supports. He lifted it, underneath in a space about 2 in deep. Running the full length of the chest were documents, folded paper, many sheets bound with a rubber band that had long since rotted away and left only a brown stain on the top page. He lifted the stack carefully and set it on the table. Macy had been watching him work through the chest with methodical patience. When the hidden compartment opened, she leaned forward without speaking. The top page was a typed letter, government letterhead, partially faded but legible. The header read United States Department of the Army, Office of the Inspector General, Washington, D.C. The date was March 7th, 1949. He read the first paragraph, then the second. The letter described what the writer called an administrative review of asset disposition records for European theater operations, fiscal years 1945 through 1948. Bureaucratic language, careful wording, the kind used by people who knew they were writing for a record. But underneath the careful language, the shape of what was being described was clear enough. Gold and valuables recovered from German military stores during the Allied advance had been catalogued and were supposed to have been transported to official custody in the American zone. Some had arrived, some had not. The letter listed the serial number ranges of gold bars identified as missing from documented shipments. Earl looked at the bars on the table. He looked at the serial numbers on the bars. The ranges matched. By the time he got to the second page, Macy was reading over his shoulder. The second page named names. 3 Army officers in the logistics chain and 1 civilian contractor attached to the logistics command, identified as Raymond James Howell. Contract number A741, Edo. There were more pages. He worked through them one at a time, setting each one face down after reading it. A second letter, Internal Army correspondence from June 1949, discussing the ongoing investigation. A third document, an Inspector General field report from an officer who had traveled to Germany to interview witnesses. The field officer's conclusions were careful but pointed. The gold had been diverted by persons with access to the transfer chain, and the last documented point of control before the diversion was a staging area in Western Germany, where Raymond Howell had been present in September 1947. Clipped to the back of the field officer's report was a handwritten note. Not co-crypt, not army-type script, but something loose and fast written in the way people wrote when they were frightened and hurrying. W. Keep this safe. If something happens to me, you'll know what to do with it. It's the only copy. R.R. Raymond Howell had given Walter Coe the gold, the wine, and the only copy of the Inspector General's report that implicated him in their disappearance. He had given Coe the evidence of what he had done, wrapped up alongside the proceeds of it, and asked a farmer in Carroll County, Ohio, to keep it safe. And then Raymond Howell had vanished from every public record, and Walter Coe had sat on all of it for 11 years, until his own heart gave out in 1961. Earl stood at his kitchen table in Carroll County, Ohio at 6:30 in the evening, looking at documents describing post-war gold from European military. Operations held by a man named Raymond Howell, passed to a farmer named Walter Coe for safekeeping in 1950, buried under a tackroom floor for 60 years, found by a farmer who had only been trying to fix the banks of a pond. He sat down. Macy sat down across from him. "This is why someone came to the door," she said. "Yeah, this is what they're looking for. Not the car, not the coins. This." He looked at the stack of documents. There were maybe 30 pages. He hadn't read past the first. "We can't know who sent that man. We can't know how they know what's here," Frank told his wife. Macy said. She told his sister. But that chain wouldn't produce someone who knew to use the phrase historical significance. That phrase came from someone who had more specific knowledge. She paused. Someone who knew about these documents before you found them. Earl thought about Robert Peaton, the attorney who had administered Walter Coe's estate, the man who had written the index card telling Lester Hadley he'd been a coward and to drain the pond. Pimpton had died in 1987. But attorneys had files, and files had successors, and the contents of a deceased attorney's client files did not simply evaporate. "Pemberton's firm," he said. Macy caught the thought immediately. If his files passed to another attorney when he died, or to a firm, someone may have had access to whatever he documented about the Coe-state, including the fact that there was something on this property that he never disclosed. Peaton knew. Earl said that's what the index card says. He was a coward and he didn't tell my father, but he documented something. Because that's what attorneys did. He put something in a file somewhere that described what he knew about this property. And when he died, that file went somewhere. And if whoever inherited that file understood what it meant, they'd have known the pond held something. They'd have known the tackroom floor held something. They'd have known the oak tree held something. Earl looked at the table. They just couldn't access any of it without owning the land, or waiting for someone who did to find it first. And then you drained the pond because the banks were going. Word got to them within 2 days through Frank's wife's sister's neighbor. Macy said it flatly, putting the chain together. And whoever it is, they came to your door before you'd even finished figuring out what you had. The kitchen was quiet. The farm was quiet around it. Earl thought about the man who had stood on his porch. Nice car, confident posture. The easy manner of someone accustomed to getting what they wanted through the polite machinery of offer and acceptance. Historical significance. His clients had a specific interest in the historical significance of what Earl had found. Not the coins, not the car, the historical significance. They had known about the documents or suspected or been told by someone who had read what Peaton had written in his file 60 years ago, that what was on the Cott property was not just gold, but something more complicated, something that connected us events large enough to still matter to people who studied such things. "Do you think they know what the documents say?" he asked. Macy considered. "I think they know the documents exist. I don't think they know exactly what's in them. If they did, they'd have come with more than one man and a vague offer. That was a reasonable analysis. Someone who knew the full contents of the Inspector General's report, who understood that what was in that chest was not just gold diverted from post-war logistics, but documented evidence of specific named individuals involved in that diversion, would not approach a farmer on a Saturday morning with a polite suggestion about market value. Earl looked at the documents on the table, then at the gold bars, then at the bottles and their straw. He had spent 20 years running a farm that had nothing extra to give, 20 years of tight margins and broken equipment, and watching the cattle numbers shrink and the fields get harder to justify. 20 years of being the man in this county who had held on barely to land that everyone understood was struggling, and that some people in the polite, indirect way of rural communities had been expecting him to eventually sell. He picked up the phone and called Claire Ashford. She answered on the second ring, still in her office, despite the hour. "There's more," he said, "significantly more, and it's complicated." She was quiet for a moment. How complicated? The kind of complicated that involves the Department of the Army in 1945, and a name I'm going to ask you to research before I say another word about it on a phone. A longer pause. "Come back to the office tomorrow morning. 8. I'll be there." He ended the call and looked at Macy. She was watching him with the expression of someone who had come out for a Sunday visit and ended up in the middle of something considerably larger than she'd planned. "You should call Jolene," he said. Macy nodded. "She's going to lose her mind. She's got a right to know." He got up and put the kettle on because it was that kind of evening, the kind that required something warm and something to do with your hands. He stood at the stove while the water heated and looked out the window at the dark farm. The pond basin, a pale shape in the night, the Buick a shadow at its edge. He thought about Walter Coe, a private man, no heirs, dying in 1961 with a chest full of someone else's gold under his tack room floor and someone else's coins in his pond and someone else's secret, written on army letterhead in a hidden compartment. He had written a letter intended to explain himself to whoever came after, and then he had died, and the attorney who handled his affairs had been a coward, and his father had put the index card in the bottom of a drawer and never pursued it, and 60 years had passed. He thought about what kind of person sat something like that for 60 years. What it cost you. What kind of man Walter Coe had been, who had gone to his grave holding Raymond Howell's secret, honoring a trust placed in him by a man whose own hands were not clean, but who had trusted a farmer with the only evidence of what he'd done. There was something in that Earl couldn't entirely sort out. Raymond Howell had done something wrong. The Inspector General's report made that clear enough, or strongly suggested it. He had been in the chain of custody when gold went missing. Whether he had taken it deliberately or been caught up in something larger, whether he had kept it or tried to return it, or simply hidden it and run, Earl didn't know. What he knew was that at the end of it, in November 1949, Howell had given everything to a farmer in Carroll County and asked him to keep it safe, and then disappeared from the record entirely. Maybe he had died. Maybe he had run further. Maybe he had found some other life somewhere and never came back. The public record offered nothing. He had been there and then he was gone. But Walter Coe had kept the trust, had kept it through the Korean War and through the 50s and into the 60s, dying with it still intact, leaving it in the best way he could by writing the letter and burying the coins as a trail, trusting that whoever came to the land next would do right by it. Earl found he respected Walter Coe, a private man with no heirs who had honored a promise to someone who probably didn't deserve it. That was a kind of integrity. He made the tea and took it to the table and sat with it in the quiet kitchen. The documents changed the dimension of what he had found. The coins were valuable. The carve was remarkable. The gold bars were extraordinary in their own right. But the documents were something else. Something that connected this farm to events that historians wrote about, that governments had classified and declassified and studied, that had consequences that ran forward through decades. He did not know yet what the right thing to do with them was. That was Claire Ashford's apartment, and she had asked him to come back in the morning and he would go. What he knew, sitting at the table with his tea in a kitchen that his father had eaten breakfast in for 40 years, was that none of this was going to be simple, and none of it was going to be quick, and the man who had come to his door was not the last person who was going to show up uninvited. He was going to need to be careful. Linda had been right about that. But careful didn't mean frightened. And it didn't mean soft, and it didn't mean the kind of retreat that looked like reasonableness, but was really just giving ground. He had spent 30 years not giving ground on this farm because his father had told him not to, and because the ground was his, and because some things you held on to, not because it was easy, but because it was right. This was his land. Those were his fines. Whatever the legal complications, whatever the history attached to those gold bars and those documents, whatever interested parties were circling at a distance and waiting to see what he did, he was the one standing on 63 acres in Carroll County, Ohio, and he was not going anywhere. Macy came into the kitchen with her phone. "Jolene is coming Friday." "Good," she said, and I'm quoting. She said, "Dad finally did something interesting." Earl felt the corner of his mouth move. Tell her the bar was low. He poured the water over the tea and stood at the window drinking it, watching the dark. Somewhere out there in the fields under the night, under 60 years of ordinary seasons, a story had been waiting. Patient in the way that buried things were patient. He had a farm to run in the morning. He had an 8 appointment in Canton. He had a 1959 Buick Electra sitting at the edge of a drained pond that needed to be assessed by someone who understood what it was. He had a chest full of gold bars with army stamps and a stack of documents he hadn't finished reading and a name he needed to trace and a lawyer he needed to trust, and daughters come home to a farm that had just become something different from what it had been 2 days ago. He set down the mug. He went out to check on the cattle before bed, walking through the barn in the dark with a flashlight, moving past the stalls the way he had done for 30 years, checking that each animal was settled and fed and undisturbed. The familiar smell of the barn settled around him. The warmth of the animals, the old smell of the wood, the same as it had always been. He paused at the tack room door, stood there for a moment. Then he went in and looked at the place where the chest had been. The hidden boards were back in place. The floor looked the same as it had looked every time he'd walked across it in 30 years. Nothing to see, but he saw it differently now. Saw the floor as something with a before and an after, a history that ran deeper than the wood. He thought about all the mornings he had come in here to get a fence stapler or a box of nails or a coil of wire and walked across those boards, without knowing all the winters he had stood here, sorting through tools, while the cold pressed against the barn walls. All the ordinary days that had passed above this floor, while Walter Coe's trust sat patient underneath it. 30 years he had been the custodian of something he hadn't known he was keeping. He turned off the flashlight and stood in the dark for a moment. 60 years he thought that Chest had sat under that floor for 60 years, while his father farmed this land. And then while he farmed it through droughts and floods and a divorce and 2 daughters growing up and moving away, and the cattle numbers shrinking and the tractor getting older and the bank account staying thin through all of it, patient under the boards holding what it held, waiting for the right moment, or just waiting because that was what buried things did. Earl walked back through the dark barn, past the cattle and the tools and the smell of all his years on this land, and went inside. Tomorrow the story would get louder. He could feel it coming. The way you felt weather coming, a change in pressure, a shift in the quality of the air. There were people who wanted what was in that chest, or wanted the story of what was in that chest, or wanted the land itself, and they would not stop at one unannounced visit. But they would have to come to him, and when they did, they would find a man who had spent 30 years learning not to be moved. He locked the back bedroom closet. He set the key on the nightstand. He lay down in the dark and listened to the farm settle around him. The old house doing what it had always done, bearing its weight with the patience of something built to last. He thought he wouldn't be able to sleep. He was wrong. Sleep came fast and deep, the way it came after real physical work, and it held him until 4:30 when the alarm went off, and he reached for it in the dark and swung his legs over to the side of the bed. And the farm was waiting, and so was everything else. He dressed. He made coffee. He stood at the window in the dark kitchen and looked out at the empty pond basin, pale in the first grey light before sunrise, the shape of the Buick visible at its edge. He had 63 acres in Carroll County, Ohio. A herd of 19 cattle, a 1959 Buick Electra in salvageable condition, 9 gold coins and 120 more, 8 gold bars with War Department stamps, 14 bottles of wine that could be worth more than he made in a year or several years. A stack of documents that connected a farmer dead off to post-war events that still apparently mattered to someone. He had a lawyer appointment in 3 hours. He had a farm to run in the meantime. He drank his coffee and watched the light come up over his fields. The same fields his father had turned and planted and worried over the same ground that had been here before any Hadley and would be here after all of them. The light came slow and pale across the ridgeline to the east, and it found the pond basin first, and then the Buick, and then the barn, and then the tack room door, and then everything else. The way morning light always moved. Starting from the edge and working toward the center, patient and unhurried as though it had all the time in the world. Earl finished his coffee, set the mug in the sink, pulled on his boots. He went outside to do the work. The cattle needed feeding, and he fed them. The fence along the south field had a post that had been leaning for 2 weeks, and he straightened it while the morning was still cold, and the light was still low, and his breath came in small clouds that the wind carried east. He checked the water trough in the north pasture. He moved a round bale with the tractor to the feeder near the barn. Ordinary work. The same work he had done every morning for 30 years. His hands knew it without instruction. His body moving through the routines, while his mind ran elsewhere through lawyers and army stumps, and the name Raymond Howell and the question of who had sent the man to his door. At 7, he came inside, washed the mud off his hands at the kitchen sink, and changed his shirt. He put the 2 metal containers in a canvas bag and the iron chest in the back seat of his truck under an old blanket. He thought about whether to bring the documents, the army correspondence from the False Bottom. He decided yes. Claire Ashford needed to see everything, and she had asked him to come back with everything. And he was not going to sit on information that a lawyer needed to do her job. He drove west on US 30 as the sun came up fully behind him. The light long and gold over the fields on both sides of the highway. Macy would stay at the farm. She had calls of her own to handle, and someone needed to be on the property. He had not said that out loud, but she had understood it without being told. 40 meter to Canton. Enough time to think. He thought about what the farm was worth if it was just a farm. The 40 acres in production, the cattle operation, the buildings and equipment, the land itself at current Carroll County values. He had a rough number in his head from the last time the county had assessed it, a number that was higher than what his father had paid, but lower than what the farm had cost him in 30 years of labor and worry. He thought about what it was worth now. The car alone, if the auction research was right, could pay off the operating debt. The coins could pay off the equipment loan he had been servicing for 4 years. The gold bars were a number too large for him to fully absorb yet. Something he kept approaching from the side rather than head-on. The way you approached a difficult piece of machinery, not straight at the hardest part, but at the edges, first getting the measure of it. The wine 14 bottles. The 1945 Petru, $43,000 per bottle if the condition held. He did not let himself calculate the total. He drove, and the fields slid past, and the sun climbed, and somewhere in Carroll County behind him. His farm sat quiet in the morning, holding 60 years, of other people's decisions waiting to see what he would do with them. He was going to do the right thing. He did not know yet exactly what the right thing was in all its legal and historical particulars. But he knew the shape of it, the general direction, honesty, documentation, transparency with the authorities who needed to know, not silence, not concealment, not the kind of transaction that happened quietly and left everyone uncertain about what had really occurred. He was a farmer. He had spent his life in a straightforward relationship with the land, putting in and taking out, keeping records, paying his taxes, doing the work that was in front of him. He was not going to become a different kind of person because of a car in a pond. He took the Canton exit and drove toward Market Avenue and the 4th floor office, where a woman with reading glasses and a clear legal pad was waiting for him with the full weight of her professional attention. And Earl Hadley of Carroll County, Ohio, who had spent 30 years holding ground on a farm that barely held back, drove toward that meeting the same way he drove toward everything. With both hands on the wheel and his eyes on the road ahead, Claire Ashford read the army documents without expression. She took her time with each page, setting it face down in a neat stack on the right side of her desk when she finished it, the same way Earl had the night before, systematic and unhurried. When she reached the handwritten note from Raymond Howell, she paused longer than she had on any other page. Then she set it on the stack with the rest, removed her reading glasses, and sat back. The morning light came through her window at a low angle, catching the dust in the air between them. "You've handled this very well," she said. Earl said nothing. Most people in your position would have either panicked and done something hasty or gone quiet and done something they'd regret. She picked up her pen and began writing on the legal pad. "You've documented everything. You've brought it to a lawyer promptly, and you've kept the property secure. That's the right sequence. What about the documents?" Macy said. Claire looked at the stack. "The documents are complicated, but not in the way you might fear. The Army Inspector General's office closed its investigation into the missing assets in 1953. That's a matter of public record accessible through FOIA requests. The investigation was closed as inconclusive. The assets were written off as unrecovered, which means that technically, from the Army's current perspective, this case does not have an open file." Earl looked at her. "That sounds too simple." "It is too simple. The Army writing off a case in 1953 doesn't mean the federal government has no interest in what's in that chest today. Gold bars with War Department stamps represent recoverable government property, regardless of how old the paperwork is. You will need to disclose the bars and the documents to the appropriate federal authority, and they will need to make a determination about the government's claim to the gold. And if they claim it, they may or they may not. These cases are genuinely unpredictable. The government's historical position on recovered post-war assets has shifted considerably in the past 20 years. There are precedents going both ways." She paused. "What I can tell you is that voluntary disclosure is treated substantially differently from discovery. A property owner who proactively comes forward and says, 'Here is what I found, and here is the documentation,' is in a fundamentally different legal position from someone who has to be investigated." Earl thought about the man on his porch about clients who wouldn't be named. "Someone already knows," he said. Claire looked at him over her glasses. "Tell me more about that." He described the visit again in more detail this time. The car, the posture, the phrase about historical significance, the offer that couldn't be attributed to anyone. Claire made notes, and this was 2 days after the story got out through your neighbor's wife. About that 2 days is fast for someone to mobilize a representative and drive to Carroll County. She set the pen down. That suggests they weren't waiting for the story to travel through the social network. They were waiting for something specific, probably news that the pond was being drained. How would they know the pond was being drained? Contractor, equipment dealer, anyone in town? He thought back. He had rented the pump from the dealer in Minerva. The dealer's son had helped him load it. He had told the dealer what it was for. Standard transaction. No reason to be discreet about it. The equipment dealer, he said. Claire nodded. Rural equipment dealers talk. If someone with long-standing knowledge of the Petton files had an informal arrangement with people in the county to watch for certain activity on certain properties, a pump rental for pond drainage on the Hadley farm would be exactly the kind of event they'd be listening for. Earl sat with that. Someone had been patient enough to wait for this moment for years, possibly decades, keeping a quiet watch through informal connections, waiting for the day the pond in the northwest corner of the old property got drained. They've been waiting longer than I've been on this farm, he said. Very likely. And their patience means they're serious. Claire picked up her pen again, which means we need to move faster than they expected you to. The rest of the meeting was procedural. Claire outlined the steps. A formal declaration of found property filed with Carroll County within 7 days. Certified appraisals of all items, coins, car, gold bars, wine documents, notification to the FBI's ART. Crime team, which handled significant found property cases involving potential government assets. Notification to the Department of the Army's Inspector General's office, not because the 1953 case was open, but because voluntary notification established Earl's good faith in the record. A cease and desist letter to any party attempting to assert a claim on the property or its contents without following proper legal channels. Earl listened and took notes in his spiral notebook. When Claire finished, she looked at both of them. I want to be honest with you about the gold bars. The government may assert a claim. If they do, you will likely not receive full market value. There are mitigation factors, finder's compensation, the age of the claim, the complexity of the chain of custody, but you should be prepared for the possibility that some portion of what's in that chest does not ultimately belong to you. Earl nodded. He had already thought this through on the drive over. The coins are different, she continued. The coins are definitively yours. Private gold acquired by Walter Coe. Legally buried on property that passed through probate and was subsequently sold to your father. Clear chain. No competing claim. She paused. The car is yours. The wine is almost certainly yours. The providence connecting it to Raymond Howell actually strengthens your claim, given that Howell had no documented heirs, and the Army's interest in the wine, if any, would be limited to the gold inventory. Almost certainly, Macy said. Wine appraisers will need to evaluate authenticity and condition before we can make definitive statements about value. But yes, the legal path for the wine is much cleaner than the path for the gold bars. Earl drove home with the chest, still in the backseat of the truck. He had not left it with Claire, who had not asked him to. Everything stayed on his property until the formal declaration was filed, and the appraisers came. That was the right sequence. Jolene arrived Friday afternoon, the way Jolene always arrived, 15 minutes later than she'd said, and already talking before she got both feet out of the car. She was 28 years old and worked in Columbus doing something with digital marketing that Earl understood even less than Macy's urban planning. But she had her mother's directness and her grandfather's humor, and she had been since she was about 6 years old the easiest person in Earl's life to be around. She hugged him in the lane, which was not something she had done without prompting since she was a teenager, and held on for a moment longer than usual. "You're okay," she said. "I'm fine because Macy said there's someone trying to buy the farm trying." He stepped back. "They won't." Jolene looked at the empty pond basin at the Buick, sitting at its edge in the afternoon light. She walked toward it without asking, circling it the way everyone did, hands in the back pockets of her jeans, taking it in from every angle. "It's beautiful," she said. "Even like this." "I know." She touched the tail fin. "What are you going to do with it? Fix it." She looked at him. "It runs," he said. "I got the engine going the first week. It needs body work and interior work and a lot of patience, but it runs." Jolene looked at the car, then at him. "I'm going to try." She nodded slowly, the nod of someone who understood something beyond the literal statement. "Good," she said. "Good for you, Dad." The appraisers came the following week. Not one appraiser, but 4, because the range of what needed to be assessed required different specialists. A numismatist from Columbus for the coins, a classic car evaluator from Cleveland who had spent 30 years handling barn finds and estate vehicles, a gold and precious metals broker licensed by the state of Ohio's office, and a wine specialist who drove from Cincinnati in a car that cost more than Earl's tractor. A slender man in his 40s named Gregory Foss, who carried his own temperature-controlled case for transporting bottles. Earl stood in his kitchen and watched 4 professionals move through his house and his barn and his yard with equipment and expertise could not have assembled himself in a year. And he felt the particular dislocation of a man whose ordinary life had suddenly required specialists. Frank Dillard showed up that morning without being asked, stood by the barn with his arms crossed and watched. Earl didn't tell him to leave. Frank had been there from the first day, and he had kept the gossip to a minimum, relatively speaking, and he was the kind of neighbor you kept close when things got complicated. Frank had told his wife, who had told her sister, who had told Ray Dunar at the hardware store, and that was how this had all accelerated in the first place. Earl had not held it against him. Frank was not a malicious man. He was a curious one, which was a different thing. And in a small county where not much happened, a car pulled from a pond was the kind of story that moved on its own momentum, regardless of anyone's intentions. What Frank had not done, to his credit, was tell anyone about the coins or the chest. He had not known about them in those first days, but when Earl had told him what was in the barn and what was under the oak tree, Frank had absorbed it quietly and kept it to himself. When people at the hardware store asked him what was really going on at the Hadley place, Frank had said he didn't know more than what was in the paper, which was very little, and then changed the subject. Earl appreciated loyalty more than most things. The numismatist, a compact man named Davier, who spoke in precise sentences and handled each coin with cotton gloves. Worked through the 129 coins over the course of 3 hours. He examined each one under magnification, consulted his grading references, and made notes in a small ledger. When he finished, he asked Earl to sit down at the kitchen table. The common dates in average to fine condition, he said, laying out his grading sheets, are worth between $2,100 and $2,200 each. That covers approximately 90 of the coins. He paused. However, 17 of the coins are what we call semi-key dates. Years with lower mintage numbers, harder to find in the market. Those range from $4,000 to $8.00 each depending on specific grade. Another pause. And 6 of the coins are key dates. High rarity, high demand. The 2 1927 D coins in your collection are among the rarest St. Godunar's double eagles ever minted. In the condition I'm grading them, each one is worth between $40,000 and $60,000. Earl looked at the grading sheets. David Yee set down his pen. Total estimated value of the coin collection at conservative auction estimates is between $340 and $380,000. At the right auction house, with the right provenance documentation and the right biders in the room, it could go higher. Frank, who had drifted to the kitchen doorway sometime in the past 10 minutes, made a sound that was not quite a word. Earl thanked David Yee and walked him out to his car and shook his hand and came back inside and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the grading sheets for a while. $340,000 conservative. The classic car evaluator, a large man named Bill Sachik, who wore a Carhartt jacket and talked about cars the way some men talked about religion, spent 2 hours with the Buick. He went over it with a flashlight and a paint depth gauge and a series of mirrors on telescoping handles. He checked the frame, the firewall, the floor pans, the trunk floor. He photographed everything. He lay on his back under the car for 20 minutes and came out with mud on his jacket and a look of quiet reverence. Frame is solid, he said to Earl. Both of them standing at the front of the car. No cracks? No previous collision damage that I can see. The water actually protected it in some ways. Kept the oxidation uniform rather than letting it concentrate in stress points. He ran his hand along the hood. Paint is gone. Essentially, surface rust through most of the body panels, but no structural rust. Nothing that compromises the metal. The chrome is salvageable, maybe 60% of it. Glass is intact, which is remarkable. He looked at the interior. Interior is a full replacement, obviously. Seats, carpet, headliner, door panels, all of it. The engine runs, Earl said. Bill Sachik looked at him. You started it, first week after I pulled it out. Something shifted in the evaluator's expression. A recalibration. A running engine on a barn find of this vintage changes the conversation significantly. He looked back at the car, as found as is. This car at auction today would likely bring between $45,000 and $60,000. To a motivated buyer who specifically collects 1959 Buick Electric, which is a smaller but passionate community, potentially more, he paused. If you restore it properly using period-correct parts, documented work, the kind of restoration that wind shows and has a paper trail, you're looking at a car that could fetch $120,000 to $150,000 at the right auction. Earl did not say anything for a moment. How long would a restoration take? Macy asked. She had come out of the house to stand beside him. Done right. 2 years minimum. Maybe 3. Bill looked at Earl. You do your own mechanical work. 30 years of it. Bill nodded. Then the mechanical side of the restoration you can handle yourself. The body work you'll need to outsource to someone good. And good means patient and expensive. The interior. You can go either direction depending on your tolerance for perfection. He folded his notepad. It's a long project, but it's the kind of project that pays you back if you do it right. Gregory Foss, the wine specialist, was in the kitchen for 90 minutes. He worked with the focus of a surgeon, examining each bottle under a portable UV light, checking the fill level through the glass, assessing the condition of the wax seals, holding each one to the light at precise angles, and making notes in a handwriting too small to read from across the table. When he finished, he sat down and folded his hands and looked at Earl with an expression that suggested he was choosing his words carefully. The provenance here is unusual, he said. Wine of this age without clear, documented chain of custody is normally very difficult to place at major. Auction. The lack of a paper trail between the original bottling and your discovery introduced, this is what the auction houses call providence risk. Earl nodded. However, Foss opened his notebook. I've examined every bottle. 13 of the 14 have fill levels consistent with proper long-term storage under cool, stable conditions, which the underground location would have provided. The wax seals are intact on all 14. The sediment pattern is consistent with genuine age. He paused. In my professional opinion, these bottles are authentic. The 1945 Petrus in particular shows exactly the characteristics you would expect from a genuine example, and the 1929 bottles are in condition I would describe as exceptional for their age. He set his notebook on the table and slid it toward Earl. The number at the bottom of the page was written in Gregory Fawkes' small, precise hand. Earl read it. Read it again. If authenticated by Fiji Auction House and sold under optimal conditions, the 14 bottles represented a conservative estimate of $610,000. The 1945 Petrus alone at $43,000 per bottle for a single example. And there were 2 of them accounted for $86,000 of that figure. The 3 1934 bottles were the next most valuable. The 1929s, of which there were 4, were extraordinary. Macy put her hand on Earl's arm. He set the notebook down carefully. The gold bars and the documents were still with the federal process, still moving through the careful machinery of disclosure and response that Claire had set in motion. The Army's Inspector General Office had acknowledged receipt of the notification. The FBI's Our Crime team had sent a field agent to examine the bars and the documents. A professional woman in her 30s, who had treated everything with more care than Earl had expected, and who had told him only that the review process would take time and that he would be informed of any claim determination. She had said nothing about timeline. She had not been unfriendly. The government might claim some or all of the gold. Earl had accepted that possibility. It was not his gold in the deepest sense. It had been diverted from a process that was supposed to return it somewhere, and the fact that it had ended up under his tack room floor did not make it entirely his in any moral accounting. He had told Claire this, and she had looked at him over her glasses and said that his moral accounting was noted and that she would pursue the maximum available legal compensation regardless. He appreciated that. A second man came to the farm the Thursday after the appraisers left. Not the same man as before. Different car, different build, same quality of suit. He stood at the end of the lane this time, didn't come to the door, just stood there by his car and looked at the property for about 10 minutes. Earl watched from the kitchen window. Then he called Claire. She called back an hour later. I've sent a cease and desist to 2 entities that I believe are connected to the original visit. One is a private estate management firm based in Columbus that I traced through some indirect research. The other is a law firm in Washington, D.C. that handled the dissolution of a company connected to Robert Petton's old practice. She paused. I'm not certain yet who the ultimate client is, but they've been warned that any further contact with you or your property that isn't conducted through proper legal channels will result in formal complaints to the Ohio Bar, and depending on circumstances, possible federal obstruction considerations given the Army's open review. No one came to the end of the lane after that. Jolene arrived Friday evening, driving up from Columbus in the small car that was perpetually overdue for an oil change, but somehow never broke down. She was the kind of person cars behaved well for. She stood in the lane in the November dark and looked at the refilled pond for a long time without saying anything. Earl stood beside her. The water caught a strip of light from the barn and held it. It looks the same, she said. It is the same pond, just the banks are better now. She looked at him sideways, and the car is in the barn. She shook her head slowly, the way she had done since she was small, when something delighted and baffled her in equal measure. Only you, Dad. Only you would drain a pond to fix the banks and find something like this and handle it the way you handled it. What way is that? Quietly, she put her hands in her jacket pockets. Most people would have sold the story to a TV show by now. He looked at the pond. Didn't need to. She stayed through the weekend. The 3 of them together in the farmhouse. The first real time that had happened, without a birthday or a Christmas attached to it. Macy drove down Saturday morning, and they worked through the afternoon, sorting through the farm's paperwork, looking at what the debts had been and what the debts were now. Looking at the operating account, with numbers in it that had not been there before. It was practical work. It was also Earl understood what his daughters needed to do. The same thing he had needed to do in September when he wrote the checks, to make the change visible, to hold the before and after in the same set of hands and feel how different the weight was. Jolene made dinner Saturday night, the way she had as a teenager when she wanted the kitchen to herself. A thing involving roast chicken and a sauce that required more steps than Earl could follow. It filled the house with a smell that pulled something loose in his chest. Memory and comfort tangled together, the particular warmth of a house where someone is cooking for the people they love. They ate late, the three of them at the kitchen table, and talked until after 10. And when the girls finally drove away Sunday morning, Earl stood in the lane until their lights disappeared and then went inside and washed the dishes and felt the house settle back into its ordinary quiet with a different quality than it used to have. The formal legal determination on the gold bars came 6 weeks later. A certified letter from the Department of the Army's Office of the Inspector General addressed to Earl Hadley, Carroll County, Ohio. He opened it at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning with Macy on the phone. Jolene on video call from Columbus and Frank Dillard standing in the kitchen doorway because Frank had somehow developed a sixth sense for the significant moments and showed up for them on request. The letter was 3 pages. Legal language, careful and precise. He read it once, then read it again slowly. The Army's determination was as follows. The gold bars in question had been carried in the Department of the Army's Lost Ledger since 1953, classified as unrecovered assets from European theater operations. Based on the evidence reviewed, including the Inspector General documents found in the false bottom of the iron chest, the Army had concluded that the chain of custody for the bars had been broken by Raymond James Howell in 1947, under circumstances that constituted conversion of government property. Howell had died in 1951, as the letter noted in a brief parenthetical that answered a question. Earl had been carrying for weeks in an automobile accident in Nevada, leaving no estate and no heirs. The bars had passed from Howell to Walter Coe in 1950 as part of an informal private arrangement. Coe had held them in good faith, Oz, without knowledge of their origin, as evidenced by his letter and by the documented absence of any communication between Coe and the Army. Coe had died in 1961 without heirs, and the property had passed through proper probate to Lester Hadley and subsequently to Earl Hadley. The Army's conclusion, based on the totality of these circumstances and on the precedent established in a series of cases it cited by number, was that the United States government's claim to the bars was time-barred under the applicable limitations period, given the length of time elapsed the good faith chain of custody from Coe forward and the voluntary disclosure by the current property owner. The bars were Earl of them. Frank made a sound like a man who had sat down hard on something unexpected. Macy said on the phone. Dad, Jolene on video, pressed both hands over her mouth. Earl set the letter down on the table. He looked at it outside. The October light was coming through the window at a low angle. The same light that had been coming through that window every October morning for 60 years, falling on the same table where his father had eaten his breakfast and where Earl had eaten his, and where the letter now lay in a rectangle of pale gold. He picked up his coffee mug and held it with both hands and looked out the window at the farm. The pond was refilled now. He had refilled it 3 weeks ago, after the excavation company had come and regrade the banks and laid the engineered fill and given him a farm back that would not eat his cattle. The water was clean and high, and the cattails along the south bank had not yet died back for the season. From here, it looked like it had always looked, a pond on a farm in Ohio, ordinary and permanent. He knew different now. He called Linda that evening, not because he had to, because she had told Macy to tell him to be careful, and he had been careful and it had worked, and she was the mother of his daughters, and she deserved to hear it from him directly. She answered after 2 rings. Her voice was the same as it had always been, the particular quality of it that he had spent 15 years falling asleep next to and 9 years, trying not to think about too specifically. I heard from Macy, she said. The letter came. It came a pause. Are you all right? He thought about the question honestly. He was 53 years old. His back hurt in the morning. He still had 19 cattle. and a tractor that was 2 years past its reliable service life, and a farmhouse that needed a new roof on the back section. He still lived alone, woke at 4:30, ate most of his meals standing at the kitchen counter. But the operating debt was paid. The equipment loan was paid. The tax arrears from the bad year in 2019 were paid. He had paid all of it in September, sitting at the kitchen table with his checkbook and the final coin appraisal in front of him, writing checks with a deliberateness that felt like something being set straight. After a long time, crooked, the bank and Carrollton had called to confirm the payments. The woman on the phone had a professional voice that gave nothing away, but Earl had heard the slight pause before she confirmed each one, the sound of numbers behaving unexpectedly. The Buick was in the barn. The engine ran. He had started it twice since pulling it inside, let it warm up, listened to it idle, and each time it had settled into something steadier than before, as though it remembered how this was supposed to go, and was finding its way back. He had ordered the first set of parts. The bodywork would wait for winter when the fields demanded. "Les, I'm all right," he told Linda. "Good." Another pause, shorter. "The girls are proud of you. I want you to know that." He looked out the kitchen window at the dark farm. "They tell me they got that from me. The telling people things." He heard something soften in her voice. Not a reopening of anything, just a settling. Lester would have been proud too. Earl had thought about his father a lot in the past 2 months. About the index card in the drawer, the one Timpton had sent to the man who bought the land, the coward's confession that Lester Hadley had received and filed away and never pursued. He had decided that his father had done what made sense to a man of his particular era and constitution. Lester Hadley had not been an incurious man, but he had been a man who believed that you worked the ground in front of you and did not go looking for trouble in the corners. The index card had been filed because filing it was the only thing he knew to do with it. He had not been negligent. He had been exactly what he was. "I think he'd have drained the pond eventually," Earl said. Linda laughed, brief and genuine. The laugh he still remembered exactly. He would have found a reason. After he hung up, he sat with the phone in his hand for a moment, then set it on the table and got up and went outside. The night was clear and cold. The sky the particular depth it got. In October in eastern Ohio, stars pressing down through air that had no haze in it. He walked to the pond and stood at the bank where he had stood on that first Saturday morning, the morning after the storm, when the pump was running and the water was going down and the world had been entirely ordinary, right up until it wasn't. The water was still now. No pump, no chain, no tractor at full strength, just a pond in a field reflecting what was above it. He stood there for a while, not thinking about anything in particular, just being a man on his own land at the end of a day that had resolved something. The cold pressed against his face and hands. The farm made its small sounds around him. He thought about Walter Coe standing somewhere on this same ground 60 years ago, dying and alone, and trying to make right what he had held in trust. Burying coins in careful oilcloth, writing a letter to no one yet, trusting the land to pass the message forward to whoever came next. Earl Hadley of Carroll County, Ohio, had come next. He had not been who CO expected, had not been Coe's daughter or Coe's kin or anyone Coe could have imagined. He had just been a farmer who needed to fix his pond banks, but he had found it, and he had handled it the way his father would have wanted him to, and the way Walter Coe would have hoped some stranger would, with honesty and care, and the quiet insistence of a man who knew the difference between what was his and what he was only keeping. Gregory Foss called the following month with news from the auction house. Authentication had been completed on all 14 bottles. The two 1945 Petrus sold in a private sale to a collector in Hong Kong before they reached public auction at $51,000 each. The 1929 bottles had gone to a European buyer at a figure that made Macy, when Earl told her, go very quiet, on the phone for a long moment. The 1934 bottles had sold individually over the course of 3 weeks to buyers in 4 different countries. The total for the wine was $740,000. Foss sent his commission invoice and a personal note that said simply, "Remarkable providence, remarkable condition, remarkable farmer." Earl pinned the note to the corkboard above his desk between a photograph of Macy and Jolene as children and a parts receipt from 1997. The coin auction was held in Columbus in December, handled by a numismatic auction house that David Ye had recommended, one that specialized in American gold and had the right buyers in their network. Macy drove down with Earl the morning of the auction. They sat in the back of the auction room, not in the bidding chairs, just watching because Claire had advised that the coins be sold through the house rather than bid on in person to avoid any appearance of manipulation. The auctioneer was a young woman who knew her material and moved through the lots with a brisk professionalism. When the Hadley collection came up, the room's energy shifted in the way auction rooms shifted when something people had been waiting for arrived. The two 1927 Double Eagles sold first separately to different telephone bidders. The first went for $62,000. The room exhaled. The second went for $68,000. Earl sat very still. By the time the last of the 129 coins were sold, the total was $412,000, 11% above David Ye's high estimate. Macy drove home. Earl sat in the passenger seat and watched the highway unspool in the headlights. The same stretch of US 30 he had driven 10,000 times in his life. He had driven it to pick up parts, to drop off cattle, to go to court when his marriage ended, to come home from the hospital after his father died. The same road, different man sitting in the passenger seat. He did not say much on the drive back. Neither did Macy. Something sat better in silence. He did not tell many people in town what the full picture looked like. He told Frank because Frank had been there from the beginning and deserved the truth and would have found out anyway. He told his daughters, who told their mother. He told Claire Ashford, who received all financial information with professional composure and charged them accordingly. But the town knew something had happened because things happened in small counties, and word moved through them the way water moved through ground, finding the low paths, covering everything. Eventually, Ray Dunar at the hardware store had stopped treating Earl with the particular gentleness reserved for men assumed to be losing, and started treating him the way you treated someone whose situation had revised upward. Carl Betts at the feed store, who had known Earl since they were both young and had watched the farm struggle through the bad years with the sympathy of a man who had his own bad years, stopped asking how things were holding up and started asking what Earl was planning next. The bank called once to ask if he had been satisfied with how his recent transactions were handled. He told them he had been. None of this was crowing. Earl did not crow, had never crowed, had no particular interest in saying to anyone, "I told you this place was worth keeping." The farm had always been worth keeping. That had never been in question in his own mind, and other people's doubts had not changed the fact of it. What had changed was that the fact was now expressed in numbers, large enough that even doubt had trouble surviving them. He was still that man. He just also had a 1959 Buick Electra in the barn that he was slowly taking apart and putting back together the right way, one piece at a time. In the evenings after the farm work was done by the light of the work lamp in the big stall, with the radio playing and the cattle settled, and the cold winter pressing against the barn walls. He had ordered new upholstery material. He had found a body shop in Worcester that did period-correct restoration work, and had driven over to meet the owner and look at his previous work, and had liked what he saw. He had sourced a set of new old Stocktail fin chrome through an online community of Buick enthusiasts who had greeted his find with the reverence it deserved and had been generous with knowledge and sources. The engine ran every time he started it. It sounded better. Macy drove out from Cleveland on the last Saturday of October. Jolene came from Columbus. They arrived within 20 minutes of each other, which Earl suspected was not entirely coincidence, and they ate dinner together in the kitchen, the three of them, the first time in several years that had happened without a holiday as the reason. After dinner, Macy washed the dishes, and Jolene dried them, the same division of labor they had fallen into as children, and Earl sat at the table and watched them and felt something settle in the room, some old tension releasing. Not a dramatic release, not anything that needed to be named, just the easing of a thing that had been held taut for a long time, without anyone acknowledging how taut it was. The farm around them was quiet in the way. Farms were quiet in late October. The season's work mostly done, the fields bare and resting, the cattle fed and still. Jolene turned from the counter. "Can we hear the engine?" They went out to the barn, all three of them, in the cold dark. Earl opened the big sliding door and turned on the work lamp, and the Buick sat in the yellow light. Half dismantled, body panels removed from the rear quarters, the hood propped open, the interior stripped to bare metal. Chrome parts laid out on the workbench in careful rows, the new upholstery fabric folded on the shelf above. Parts receipts pinned to the wooden post where Earl tracked the work. Every hour he had put into it documented the same way he documented everything, in a spiral notebook that now had 40 pages of notes on parts sourced. Work completed, work remaining. It looked like exactly what it was, a project in the middle of itself, unfinished, but pointed firmly toward becoming something. Jolene walked around it slowly. She ran her hand along the edge of the hood. The same gesture Earl had made the first morning he pulled it from the mud, that instinctive need to touch the thing to confirm it was real through the palm. "The color's coming back," she said. She was looking at the door panel where Earl had done preliminary metal work. The surface now clean and primed, the deep green of the original paint showing in the edges where the primer met the remaining original surface. "You can see what it was. I know what it'll be," Earl said. She looked up at him. Something in her expression went quiet for a moment, the way a face went quiet when it was receiving information it hadn't expected. He got in the driver's side and put the key in. Macy stood at the front. Jolene stood at the back with her hand still on the car, touching it the way you'd touch something you wanted to remember precisely. He turned the key. The engine caught on the first try. It ran rough for 10 seconds. The cold metal finding its temperature, the way cold engines always did, needing time to remember the heat. Then it smoothed, found its idle, settled into the steady rhythm of a machine that had come back from somewhere long and dark, and decided that it had more to do. The sound filled the barn. The cattle stirred in their stalls. Frank Dillard, who had somehow materialized in the barn doorway in the way he had been materializing at important moments all autumn, stood with his arms crossed and his hat back on his head, saying nothing, just listening. Macy had her hand over her mouth. Jolene was laughing. A real laugh. The kind that surprised itself, the kind that came from somewhere below's ordinary happiness and rose up without permission. Earl kept his hands on the wheel and felt the vibration come up through the frame and into his arms and through his shoulders and settle in his chest. An old engine running, a dead thing breathing. The particular satisfaction of work completed on something that most people would have left in the mud. He thought about the morning the pump started and the water began going down. The first dark shape in the basin, his hand on cold metal at the base of the pond, the letter in the oilcloth, and the coins in their careful rows in the chest under the boards, and the documents in the false bottom, and the name Raymond Howell, and the name Walter Coe, and the index card that said, "If you drain the pond, you will understand." He understood now all of it, the whole shape of what one careful private man had tried to preserve, and what it had cost him, and what had been waiting under the ground of this farm for the right person to come along and be honest about what they found. He shut the engine off. The barn went quiet. The echo of it stayed in the air for a moment. The way sound stayed in an enclosed space, pressing against the rafters before finally giving up. Frank unfolded his arms and looked at the car. "That's something," he said. It was the most Frank had said about anything in 2 months. "It will be," Earl said. They walked back to the house. Frank went home. Macy sat with Earl for another hour in the kitchen with Dee off coffee and the farm quiet outside. And they talked about nothing important, about the cattle and the winter forecast, and a fence post on the east side that was going to need attention before spring. Ordinary talk. The kind of talk that said without saying it that ordinary was what they were returning to, and ordinary was good. She left around 10. Earl stood on the porch and watched her taillights go down the lane. He stood there for a while after they were gone in the cold dark, looking at his farm. The pond was in the northwest corner where it had always been, full and still. The barn stood where it had stood for 60 years, its boards the same boards his father had worked around, its roof holding against whatever the winter would bring. The fields were bare and waiting. The soil turned over at the end of the season, patient for spring. The oak at the corner of the east fence stood where it had always stood, larger than anything else along that line, its roots running deep and in every direction underground. He had 63 acres. He had a small herd of cattle that would grow this year, because he could afford the investment now, could buy back what the thin years had cost him, one head at a time. He had a 1959 Buick Electra in the barn that would take him 2 years to finish, and that he intended to drive through Carrollton when it was done. Not to make a point to anyone, but because a car like that was made to be driven, and he had given himself the project, and he intended to complete it. He had his daughters, who called and visited, and had started coming home more often than the calendar required, drawn back by something that the farm now represented to them more clearly than it had before. He had Frank Dillard, who showed up when things mattered, and kept his mouth shut, when keeping his mouth shut was the right choice, and could be counted on, which was the only qualification that had ever mattered in a neighbor. He had the land, his father's land, Walter Coe's land before that, and whoever else is before that. All the way back to a time before deeds and county records, when it had just been ground, just earth, just the particular red clay and stone of eastern Ohio that had been here through everything, and would be here after everything. Earl Hadley stood on the porch of his farmhouse and breathed the cold November air and looked at what he had, and for the first time in longer than he could precisely remember. The looking did not come with a weight attached. The tractor needed a new fuel pump. The back field had a drainage problem that wanted attention. The cattle needed worming in the spring. There was always the work. There was always the next thing. But underneath all of it, under the daily arithmetic of a working farm, something had shifted in the foundation. Something that had been precarious for years without his ever acknowledging how precarious it had been, set right quietly and permanently by a storm and a pump and a chain in the mud, and 60 years of patience stored in the ground of a farm in Carroll County. He went inside. He locked the door. He made tea and drank it, standing at the kitchen window looking out at the dark. Then he went to bed. He slept until 4:30, when the alarm went off, and he reached in the dark and swung his legs over the side. And the farm was waiting, and so was everything else. The same as it had always been, except that it wasn't. He got up. He made coffee. He pulled on his boots. He went outside to do the work. The Buick was finished the following September, a Tuesday in the middle of the month, when the light was still long and the weather had turned the particular cool that eastern Ohio got in that window between summer's last effort and autumn's arrival. A sweetness in the air that only lasted a few weeks, and that Earl had always associated with the farm at its best. He drove it out of the barn for the first time under its own power, restored and complete. The deep green paint catching the morning light with exactly the warmth that color had always been meant to carry. The chrome was back, all of it. Each piece sourced and fitted with patience he had not known he had. The interior matched the original specification. The dashboard was restored to working order. The engine ran the way it was built, to run with the particular authority of a large American V8 from an era when that configuration was made by people who believed in it completely. He drove the length of the lane and back, then sat with the engine idling in front of the barn, looking at the farm through the windshield. Macy had come down for the day. She stood in the lane with her phone out, taking photographs, the same way she had stood there 2 years earlier, looking at the muddy ruin from the pond, saying almost to herself that it was incredible. Even like this. Frank walked over from his place, without being called, and stood at the fence line with his hands in his pockets, looking at the car the way he had looked at it that first morning, when it was still dripping pond mud. He didn't say anything for a long while. Then, he walked up the lane and put his hand on the roof. "Your father would have lost his mind," he said. Earl looked at his neighbor. "In what way?" "The best one," Frank said. Earl nodded. He put the car in drive and pulled out onto the county road and drove toward Carrollton the way he had told himself he would. Not to make a point to anyone, but because a car built to be driven had been waiting long enough, and the road was open, and there was nothing stopping him. The fields on both sides were still green in the September morning. His fields. The same ground his father had bought for $11,000 in 1963. The same ground that had held everything in its northwest corner and its east fence line and its tack room floor for 60 years. Patient as only buried things could be patient, waiting for the right person to come along and be honest about what they found. The engine ran. The farm fell away behind him in the mirror, smaller and smaller and entirely intact. Still there, still his, going nowhere. He drove. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next.